Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere weird, somewhere damp, somewhere full of candles, prayers, sewers, superstitions, and a truly questionable understanding of anatomy. That's right, we're going to medieval Europe, specifically into the childbirth chamber. You're about to be surrounded by nervous women, dried herbs tied up with string, the lingering scent of sheep fat candles, and the absolute absence of anesthesia. So buckle up, because you probably won't survive this, statistically speaking. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That's the rule. And tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I'm curious to know who else is up at this ridiculous hour. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, childbirth in the Middle Ages. If you're imagining something vaguely noble, like an elegant woman reclining on a velvet chaise while a midwife gently catches the baby, stop. You've watched too many period dramas. Reality looked more like a crowded wooden room with straw-covered floors, an open hearth, sweat, screams, and probably a neighbour who'd just finished milking her goats. First things first, let's get something out of the way. Medieval people did not understand biology. Like, not even a little bit. They weren't just wrong, they were creatively wrong. To them, the uterus wasn't just an organ. It was a mysterious, shifting creature. Sometimes they believed it wandered around your body like a lost child, causing everything from hiccups to hysteria. Yes, hysteria, the diagnosis that conveniently explained any time a woman had feelings, thoughts, or, trauma. But even before any of that, conception had to happen. And let's just say, if you lived in medieval Europe and wanted a baby, you were going to need more than just some romantic candlelight. You'd also need the proper astrological alignment, the blessing of a local saint, and possibly a fertility potion made from eel fat honey, and the bark of a tree that may or may not cause hallucinations. There were manuals passed around, not exactly medical texts, more like collections of hearsay and wishful thinking that advised everything from praying to Saint Anne, patron saint of fertility, to not conceiving under the wrong moon phase. Because obviously, the moon controlled your womb, naturally. And here's a fun fringe fact. Some texts suggested that if a woman wanted to conceive a boy, she should lie on her right side during intercourse, and if she wanted a girl, her left. No mention of genetics, of course, just the old reliable turn and hope strategy. When conception actually did occur, there were no early detection kits. You just waited, and waited, and if you stopped bleeding and started craving clay or sour milk, congratulations. Maybe you were pregnant, or maybe you had worms, or a tumour. Honestly, who's to say? This is where the guessing game began. Women might consult a wise woman or herbalist, someone with a reputation for knowing things, which, in medieval terms, meant they had at least 3 teeth and didn't panic when someone fainted. There was also a test that involved soaking a woman's urine in a cloth and seeing what colour it turned. Spoiler, the results were useless, but it gave people something to do. Once pregnancy was confirmed by missed periods and a general sense of bloat, the preparation began, and no, not the kind that involved baby showers or gender reveals. We're talking salt charms hung in windows, incense burned to protect the womb, and serious discussions about which saints to bother on your behalf. Saint Margaret was a popular one, allegedly burst out of a dragon's stomach, which made her ideal for aiding women during labour. You would also find charms tucked under mattresses and prayers carved into bread, then eaten. Delicious, spiritually crunchy. And in the midst of all this, you, the pregnant woman, would start to vanish from public life. Pregnancy was private, taboo even. Men didn't want to hear about it, see it, or be reminded that it was their fault. So instead, women leaned on one another. Experienced mothers, midwives, neighbours. It wasn't glamorous, but it was communal. What's interesting is how childbirth in the Middle Ages was not seen as a medical event, but a spiritual one. The idea was that birth mimicked the pain of Eve's punishment in Genesis. You were suffering for the original sin, because obviously one bite of fruit thousands of years ago totally justified the need to scream through 16 hours of labour with no pain meds. And it wasn't just the act of birth that was religious, it was the entire 9 months. Women carried amulets engraved with prayers. They whispered invocations before sleeping. Some even tied pieces of blessed cloth around their waistbands. One popular belief claimed that the Virgin Mary would personally protect a woman in labour if she recited a specific prayer every night before bed. If you forgot one night, well, hope you enjoyed breathing. Now here's where things get messy, and not just emotionally. Let's talk about the birthing space. As the due date approached, women would transform a room in their house into a kind of sacred delivery chamber. Windows were shuttered, curtains drawn, light was kept dim, fire stoked to keep the room warm. Why? Because cold air, they believed, could cause the baby to retreat or turn back, which, anatomically, makes zero sense, but sounded very convincing if you said it with enough confidence. This room, known as the lying-in chamber, was off-limits to men. Absolutely no dudes allowed, not even the husband. It was considered a female-only sanctuary, run entirely by women. The midwife took centre stage, of course, but you'd also find helpers, older relatives, maybe the town herbalist, a neighbour who just liked showing up to things. They boiled water, not for cleaning, they didn't really do that, but to keep the room humid. They scattered herbs like lavender and chamomile to calm the spirits. They might tie red ribbons around your wrists to ward off evil. The entire setup looked more like a seance than a delivery room, but that's kind of the vibe. Birth wasn't just biological, it was mystical and terrifying. And let's be honest, it still kind of is. So here you are, 9 months in, belly the size of a wine barrel, stuck in a room that smells like wood smoke and thyme, surrounded by nervous women muttering half-remembered prayers. You don't know if the baby's going to make it. You don't know if you're going to make it. But at least someone remembered the holy relic, and someone else brought a goose feather to fan you with. You're doing great, sweetie. And that's just the beginning. So there you are, tucked into the warmth of your candlelit birthing chamber, your swollen ankles propped up on a scratchy woolen pillow, while nervous whispers drift from the women hovering nearby. But let's rewind a bit, because you didn't just fall pregnant by accident, not if the village women had anything to say about it. In medieval Europe, getting pregnant wasn't always simple, and for couples trying to conceive, the road was paved with more than just awkward fumbling under linen sheets. There were rituals, so many rituals. First off, if you weren't conceiving quickly, it clearly meant something was spiritually off. Maybe you angered a saint. Maybe the stars weren't aligned. Maybe you stepped over a grave on your way to market, or your mother-in-law gave you the evil eye during Lent. Point is, you needed divine intervention, and preferably from someone with a beard and a spot in the celestial hierarchy. So you'd visit a local priest or monk, and they might recommend a pilgrimage, not a short walk down the lane. Oh no, we're talking days of trudging through mud, praying at the shrine of St. Gerard Majella or St. Margaret, both known to be pretty pro-baby. And while you were there, you'd leave behind a little token, maybe a wax model of a baby, or a tiny carved cradle, or, weirdly often, a key, symbolizing the unlocking of the womb. That's right. Your uterus just needed a skeleton key and some sweet talk. And if the saints weren't fast enough, you might call on your local wise woman. These ladies were half healers, half therapists, and full-time collectors of unsettling fertility concoctions. One of the more common remedies? Drinking a tea made from boiled hair bones. Why? Because rabbits have a lot of babies. Perfect logic. Or maybe you'd smear a poultice of ground deer antler and honey across your abdomen and chant the Lord's Prayer backwards at dawn. But let's talk about one of the more popular theories, seed and soil. Medieval scholars believed conception was like farming. The man provided the seed and the woman's body was the soil. If the soil was cold or dry or imbalanced in humours, no baby for you. Doctors, recommended warming the womb with hot compresses and food that made your body hot and moist. That meant red wine, fatty meats and spicy stews. Women were sometimes advised to eat roasted pigeon hearts. No one really knew why, it just felt vaguely magical and full of protein. Now here's a fact that toes the line between creepy and oddly sweet. Some medieval communities believed that conceiving under a full moon increased the chances of a child with good health and clear skin. People planned their intimate moments accordingly, lying on their left sides, holding hands, and avoiding eye contact with any cats in the room just in case they were witches spying on you. Of course, not every couple was trying to conceive out of joy. Sometimes it was about producing heirs, keeping land in the family, or avoiding accusations of infertility. A woman without children might face whispers that she was cursed, or worse, barren, which in medieval terms practically meant she was broken goods. Men weren't held to the same standard, naturally. If a child didn't come along, it was probably her womb's fault, not his seed. Super fair. And then there were the, let's call them highly experimental conception tactics. In one well-circulated manuscript, a woman is instructed to collect dew from a graveyard at sunrise and mix it with ash from a blessed candle, then drink it while standing under a blooming apple tree. If that didn't work, try again next full moon. That was the attitude. Just keep trying, and maybe next time your uterus would finally cooperate. Some truly fringe theories bordered on dangerous. One remedy involved rubbing goose fat and mercury on your belly, which, no surprise, led to all kinds of health problems. But people were desperate. The pressure to produce children was immense, especially for noble women whose entire social standing often hinged on their ability to birth a son. No son? You might find yourself quietly sent off to a convent, or just slowly ignored until your husband conveniently found someone younger and more fertile. And the church? Oh, the church had thoughts. Priests regularly preached about the moral dimensions of sex. Only in marriage, only for procreation, no pleasure allowed. Anything else was, obviously, the devil's playground. Some theologians believed that even within marriage, enjoying the act too much could taint the resulting child. Imagine growing up knowing your conception was considered too fun to be holy. But here's where things take a surprisingly human turn. Despite all the rituals, fear, and judgment, conception was still seen as a miracle. When a woman became pregnant, it was something to celebrate, even quietly. Neighbours would bring her dried herbs, offer whispered prayers, and sometimes leave tiny gifts on her doorstep. A dried orange, a length of ribbon, a carved wooden rattle. It wasn't exactly a baby registry, but it meant something. Still, for many women, the joy of conception came with a quiet, lingering dread. You weren't just growing a child, you were stepping into a world of pain and risk. You might not make it out, the baby might not make it out. And there was nothing like a 1,000-year-old saint statue staring at you to remind you of your mortality. But before any of that could happen, you had to confirm the pregnancy, and we're back to guessing. If you stopped menstruating, if your back hurt, if you started dreaming about water or animals, that was considered a sign. In one popular folktale, a woman dreamt of holding a burning candle and was told she'd soon bear a boy. Another dreamt of being chased by chickens and ended up having twins. Science? No. But vibes? Very strong. And once you were sure, you might go see a local midwife to get her opinion, which she would give after poking your belly, smelling your breath, and maybe holding your urine up to a candle to see what colour it turned. Because when in doubt, medieval people always went back to pee. The whole process, trying to conceive, recognising pregnancy, praying it was a boy, was a marathon of anxiety, blind faith, and kitchen witching. It was all part of the terrifying miracle. And even if you knew what was coming, even if this was your third or fourth child, nothing made it easier. You were a woman in the Middle Ages, carrying a life you hoped would grow. And as your belly swelled and the gossip around you softened into coos of support or envy, you quietly prepared for what came next. 9 months of watching the stars, avoiding salted fish, and sleeping on your left side, all leading up to a room full of women and prayers. And if you were lucky, really lucky, it might all go exactly as planned. So you're pregnant. Congratulations or condolences, depending on whether this was your plan or just an unfortunate side effect of marital duty. Either way, here you are, swollen and slightly terrified, surrounded by old wives and older advice. But before anyone can pat your belly or hand you a dried root to chew, you're left with one burning question. Are you actually pregnant? Because in the Middle Ages, there were no blood tests, no ultrasounds, and no digital sticks to pee on and anxiously watch change colour. Instead, you had guesswork, bodily omens, and one very dramatic urine test involving wheat and barley. Let's start with the obvious signs. First, you stop menstruating. That's your big clue. But medieval people didn't see menstruation as a helpful biological cycle. It was more like your body purging its bad blood. The womb was considered a place that needed to vent, and if it suddenly stopped doing so, it meant either a pregnancy or a problem. Either way, time to panic. Other clues? Welling breasts, nausea, strange cravings, and fatigue. Of course, all of these could also point to plague, demons, or just a really bad stew. So women relied on instinct and gossip. One neighbour might swear that if your eyes looked sparkly, you were pregnant. Another might tell you to lick a rusty coin and see if your tongue tingled. Helpful? Not even remotely. But everyone had an opinion, and none of it was science. Now here's where it gets fun. the barley test. This test comes straight out of an Egyptian medical text but made its way into medieval Europe through various translations. The idea was this: take a woman's urine and soak some wheat and barley grains in it. If the grain sprouted, she was pregnant. If the barley sprouted first, it was a boy. If the wheat did out, a girl. And if nothing sprouted at all, either she wasn't pregnant or the grains were just lazy. It was a toss-up. But hey, it beat standing in front of a candle sniffing your own pee, which was another genuine diagnosis method. Of course, doctors, or the rare ones who treated women, had their own theories. Some would take your pulse, although they didn't know what a pulse actually did, or press down on your abdomen and claim they could feel the baby's fluttering. Others would look at your complexion and declare that a ruddy face meant a boy, while a pale face meant a girl, or possibly that you were dying. These diagnoses were about 80% guesswork and 20% dramatic flair. One fringe theory suggested that pregnant women's saliva would become sweet, so naturally someone had to taste it. We can only hope they delegated that job. Meanwhile, another theory said that if you held a piece of cheese to your breast and it absorbed some of the skin's moisture, you were pregnant. If it stayed dry, then clearly your womb was just being dramatic again. Let's not forget the dreams. Dreams were taken very seriously in the medieval world. Pregnant women were told to write down their dreams or tell them to a wise woman. Dreaming of water, especially rivers, was considered a strong sign of pregnancy. Dreaming of fruit, especially apples, often meant fertility. But dreaming of fire or bleeding animals, that meant miscarriage, or, that you'd eaten a spoiled turnip before bed. And because nothing could ever be simple, these signs were also interpreted differently based on region, religion, and who your midwife's second cousin once talked to. One woman's morning sickness was another's divine punishment. Some communities believed nausea meant a girl, while others claimed it meant twins. And if you had no symptoms at all, clearly the baby was trying to sneak up on you. Stealth fetus. But let's say you're convinced now. You feel movement, or at least think you do. In medieval terms, this was called the quickening, and it usually happened around the 4th month. It was the first fluttering or kick, and it was a huge deal. Before this point, the fetus wasn't really seen as alive yet. Quickening was the moment the soul was believed to enter the baby's body. After that, everything became more sacred, more dangerous, and a lot more superstitious. Now that the baby was sold, you had to be even more careful. No loud arguments near the mother, no touching iron tools, no walking through graveyards or sitting on certain types of wood. Some women even wore protective charms under their dresses, like tiny lead crosses or leather pouches with snippets of holy text. Others tied blue ribbons around their waists to guard the womb. The logic? None. The commitment? Impressive. And of course, you couldn't just go around looking pregnant. Modesty was still very much a thing. Women wore loose gowns and extra aprons to hide their growing bellies. Public discussions of pregnancy were seen as crude. Instead, everything was couched in euphemism. You were in a delicate state, blessed by God, or simply resting more often. The entire experience was shrouded in modesty, secrecy, and a touch of denial. This is probably a good moment to mention the social divide. If you were poor, your pregnancy meant carrying on with chores until the baby basically dropped out. If you were rich, you could afford to slow down, maybe even hire a maid to carry your firewood or stir your stew. But no matter your class, you weren't spared the anxiety. The risk of miscarriage hung over every expectant mother, and medieval people had theories. One such theory claimed that if a woman stared at anything disturbing during pregnancy, her child could be marked by it. Look at a deformed animal. Your baby might have a limp. See a man with a beard while you're startled? Your baby could be born hairy. No pressure. Another theory warned against thinking too hard while pregnant. Heavy thoughts could sink the womb, causing complications. So women were encouraged to think only good thoughts. As if that's easy when you're vomiting every morning and the local priest keeps reminding you that childbirth is your punishment for being descended from Eve. Even cravings were taken as signs. If you craved meat, it meant the child would be strong. If you craved sweets, the baby would be beautiful. And if you craved chalk, which many did, it meant, well, nothing good. Possibly anemia. Possibly demons, best not to ask. By the time you reached the 6th or 7th month, the guessing game evolved into gentle preparation. The women in your life might start sewing little caps or weaving cradles. Some mothers started sleeping with a saint's medallion under their pillow, while others refused to leave the house entirely. One curious tradition involved pouring milk in a bowl and placing it by the hearth. If it curdled overnight, that meant a smooth delivery. If it stayed fresh, well, maybe try another charm. Ultimately, you were left in this weird liminal space between joy and dread, hope and fear. You felt the baby move, you felt your body change. You had dreams and symptoms and possibly a mouldy barley sprout that told you you were carrying a girl. You still didn't know anything, but in the Middle Ages that was just reality. And so you waited, swaddled in layers, clutching a saint's token, trying not to sneeze too hard or think about fire. Because you were pregnant in a world with no certainty, and you were doing your best with the tools you had. You would think being pregnant in a time before hospitals, prenatal vitamins, or even soap would be difficult enough, but medieval Europe really liked to turn up the difficulty setting. As your belly grew and your centre of gravity slowly betrayed you, you weren't just dealing with the physical weight of the baby, you were also carrying the invisible burden of every superstition, medical myth, and unsolicited advice the village could offer. Because this wasn't just a pregnancy, it was a full-blown spiritual and cosmological event. Let's talk wombs, or rather what people thought wombs were. Medieval anatomy wasn't based on observation so much as imagination. Scholars, most of whom had never even seen a uterus, were deeply convinced it had a mind of its own. One of the most enduring beliefs, that the womb could travel, literally wander through your body like a bored tourist looking for better real estate. If you had shortness of breath, that could be your womb pressing on your lungs. A headache, maybe it had climbed to your skull. No one thought to check your sinuses, they were too busy blaming your migratory reproductive organs. This concept of the wandering womb came from ancient Greek medicine and stuck around for centuries like a bad habit. The cure? Strong-smelling substances. Midwives or healers would hold sweet-smelling herbs or even pour garlic near your lower half to coax the womb back into place, like luring a cat out from under the bed with treats. Simultaneously, they'd wave something foul like burned hair or pitch near your mouth or nose to drive it downward. It sounds made up because it is, but people were committed, and it didn't stop there. Many believed the womb was powered by vapours. Yes, vapours. Invisible, moody emissions that could either stabilise your pregnancy or throw your entire system into chaos. Good vapours meant glowing skin and a happy baby. Bad vapours caused you fainting spells, hysteria, or, in extreme cases, death. You might be prescribed calming herbs like mugwort, or told to avoid looking at red fabric, which could excite the womb into misbehaviour. Medieval logic was basically, if it's weird, it's true. Another gem of the time, the idea that the mother's emotions directly shaped the baby's soul and body. This wasn't just a poetic metaphor, it was taken literally. If you were angry too often, your child might be born with a red temperament and grow up to be violent. Cry too much and you might give birth to a melancholic child. Laugh too loud, that's how you get jesters. Basically, you had to live like a saint just to avoid raising a future town menace. And if anything went wrong, say a child was born with a deformity or illness, it wasn't chalked up to chance or genetics. It was your fault. You didn't pray hard enough. You ate the wrong fish. You looked at a pig the wrong way during the 3rd week of pregnancy. Sorry. But wait, there's more. Lunar cycles played a starring role in your prenatal care. It was believed the moon controlled not just tides, but wombs. Conceiving during a waxing moon? You might have a strong, healthy boy. Waning moon? Possibly a girl or a child prone to illness. Full moon? That was a gamble. Some thought it brought blessings, and others thought it opened portals to influences. And if you went into labour during an eclipse? Oh boy, people might throw holy water on you just in case. And then there were the foods. Everyone had an opinion about what a pregnant woman should and shouldn't eat. Not for nutrition, no one had figured out vitamins yet, but to control the baby's temperament, gender, and general vibe. Craving onions? That was a bad omen. It meant the baby would be weepy or stinky, possibly both. Craving apples? That meant beauty and sweetness. Meat was encouraged, especially if you wanted a boy, but too much could make the child hot in temperament, which meant they might be impulsive or violent. Fish was safer, but only if it had scales. Scaleless fish, like eels or catfish, were considered unclean and could allegedly cause birth defects. This was about as scientific as throwing darts in a thunderstorm, but people followed it with religious devotion. Spices were also suspect. Nutmeg was fine. Cinnamon, iffy. Saffron, risky. And don't even get anyone started on garlic. Some thought it scared away evil spirits. Others believed it heated the blood too much. Either way, your stew was now a spiritual minefield. And let's not forget the belief that your surroundings influenced your unborn child. You were advised to only look at beautiful things, stare at flowers, tapestries, or clean water, avoid ugly people, avoid dirty places. Definitely avoid animals giving birth, unless you wanted your baby to act like a goat. People truly believe that the sights and sounds absorbed during pregnancy imprinted on the fetus. If you looked at deformed wood, your baby might have twisted limbs. If you were startled by a storm, the child might grow up anxious. It sounds absurd, but in a world without medical understanding, it was easier to blame aesthetics. On the fringe of all this were more magical beliefs, little charms and folk practices passed down by midwives and hedge witches. Some women wore amulets made from wolf teeth to grant the child strength. Others tied tiny bundles of herbs to their undergarments. There were even whisperings that placing a silver spoon under your pillow would ward off nightmares and ensure a smooth delivery. Most of these practices were tolerated, unless the church caught wind and decided they smelled too much like witchcraft. Speaking of the church, it had a love-hate relationship with all this womb folklore. On one hand, clerics wanted to control the narrative. Pregnancy was Eve's curse. Suffering in childbirth was a divine punishment. On the other hand, they couldn't stop people from carrying pocket saints and praying to the Virgin Mary while also chewing licorice root to cool the blood. Religion and superstition danced uncomfortably close in the realm of childbirth, and no one had the heart or the medical knowledge to separate them cleanly. One scholarly debate of the time, and yes, there were debates even if no one knew what they were talking about, was whether a fetus had a soul at conception or only after quickening. This had serious theological implications. If a woman miscarried early, was it the death of a soul or just an unfortunate biological accident? Theologians argued back and forth, scribbling on parchment with ink made from oak galls, while actual pregnant women quietly bled out in candlelit rooms. The disconnect was stark and honestly not much different from certain debates today. So here you are, 6 months in, your back aches, your ankles are swollen, and someone just told you that stepping over a black chicken will curse your child's lungs. Great, you clutch your bundle of dried rosemary a little tighter and mutter a prayer to St. Margaret, because even if you don't quite believe it, doing something feels better than doing nothing. You're part of a long line of women balancing magic, religion, and very bad source science, all for the chance to bring a child into a world that's mostly hay and firewood. You have no idea what's going to happen next, but the moon is full tonight. Maybe that's a good sign. As your belly grows and your bones begin quietly revolting against you, the world around you starts to shift. People notice. Some congratulate you in hushed tones. Some give you long, pitying stares like they're already writing your eulogy. Because let's be honest, childbirth in the Middle Ages wasn't a guaranteed round trip. It was more like stepping into a very slow, very painful lottery, with blood on the floor and saints watching from the walls. Still, life goes on. And while you're waddling through this sacred misery, there's one thing everyone has an opinion on: what you eat. Cravings weren't just tolerated, they were analysed, judged, and in some cases, feared. You're hungry for salty fish? Maybe that means the child will be clever. Sweet things? Perhaps a girl destined to be lovely and mild. But if you crave coal, clay or dirt, which, let's be honest, a lot of women did, that wasn't chalked up to mineral deficiency. No, that was a spiritual imbalance. Worse, it was a sign your baby might be born marked, with skin spots, odd birthmarks, or in some cases, a taste for sin. Subtle, but here's where it gets really medieval. Food was seen as direct communication with the womb, not the baby, the womb. A living, moody being inside you that needed to be bribed, soothed and occasionally tricked. You might be told to eat hot foods, like roasted meats or wine-based stews, to balance your humours if your complexion seemed too pale, or your mood too weepy. On the other hand, too much heat and you risked burning the womb's inner lining. Cold foods, like cucumber or milk, that were said to slow down the baby's movements, unless of course the baby was moving too much, in which case cold food was suddenly the answer. And then there were the forbidden foods. You'd be warned against beans, especially broad beans, because they were thought to cause gas and internal wind, which could jostle the fetus in the womb and lead to premature birth. Also on the naughty list, eel, slippery, soulless, raw onions, associated with anger, and strong cheese, possibly possessed. Drinking too much water was suspicious too. After all, the womb was a moist enough place already, no need to drown it. But nothing caused more controversy than eggs. Some said eggs were nourishing and symbolically perfect, life wrapped in a neat little shell. Others swore that eating too many would lead to cowardly children. Soft-boiled? Slightly better. Fried in oil? Now you're really gambling. It's not just what you eat, it's how. You should sit upright while eating lest the food fall to one side of the womb. Chew slowly. Pray before each meal, and absolutely no eating during a storm. Lightning, apparently, could spoil your digestion and mark the baby with a bad omen. And if you happen to drop food on the floor, don't eat it. Not because of germs, medieval people had no idea about germs, but because the floor was spiritually unclean. The baby might absorb that uncleanliness. Bon appetit. Of course, all these dietary laws depended on who you were. If you were a peasant woman, your pregnancy diet looked more like whatever's available. Bread, onions, maybe a bit of dried meat if you were lucky. If you lived near the coast, salted fish. If you lived inland, probably porridge until the end of time. There were no prenatal supplements, just herbal teas, hope, and your great-aunt's opinions. The wealthier classes had more options, but that didn't mean better outcomes. In fact, rich diets often led to what we'd now call gestational diabetes, though in medieval terms that just meant she's round like a melon and very tired. The nobility indulged in rich pies, honeyed fruits, roasted game, and spiced wine, which sounded delightful until you realise most of it was preserved with mouldy techniques and cooked in lead-lined pans. Let's not forget the community rituals around food. In some villages, pregnant women weren't allowed to cook. Not out of kindness. This was based on the belief that their volatile womb spirits could spoil food. In other regions, they were encouraged to bake bread as a way to pass warmth to the baby. These loaves were sometimes stamped with a cross or a charm. You could eat the bread, but only after saying a prayer, and definitely not during a solar eclipse. There were even recipes passed down for pregnancy potions, which were less potion and more chaotic soup. Common ingredients included fennel, cumin, vinegar, and sometimes beer, because who doesn't want their potion a little bubbly? Some midwives recommended a broth made from chicken feet and crushed rose petals, while others leaned into wine thickened with cinnamon and fig pulp. The idea was to soften the womb or sweeten the child's disposition. What they mostly did was make you burp with regret. And then we have the cravings that were too weird to ignore: women who licked stones, women who drank vinegar straight from the bottle. One record mentions a woman who ate beeswax candles. Another insisted she needed to sleep with a loaf of bread under her pillow every night. Not eat it, just sleep with it. According to her midwife, it calmed the baby. According to modern science, it was a carb-loaded security blanket. Either way, she swore by it. Some women believed that ignoring cravings was dangerous, not for the mother, but for the child. If you craved pears and didn't eat them, the baby might be born with a pear-shaped birthmark. Or worse, stillborn. This idea of maternal impression haunted women, especially those whose pregnancies ended badly. Because if something went wrong, people would start asking questions. What did you eat? What did you crave and ignore? What did you see while pregnant that might have upset the baby's soul? And of course, when tragedy did strike, none of this speculation helped. A miscarriage wasn't just a loss, it was an accusation. You must have eaten the wrong herb, or allowed yourself to be startled by thunder, or skipped your evening prayer. This deep-seated blame followed mothers through every stage of pregnancy. You were responsible for the child's body, soul, temperament, and future sins. No pressure. Still, not everything was so dire. There were moments, quiet, domestic moments, when the village women would sit with you and laugh about cravings, or offer to bring you the sour cherries you couldn't stop dreaming about. An older woman might give you her own stash of dried apricots, saved from last season. These gestures weren't medically significant, but they were deeply human. They reminded you that you weren't alone in this bizarre, uncomfortable, sacred process. So you keep eating, chewing slowly, choosing your foods with a strange cocktail of fear, intuition, and whatever that old midwife from 3 doors down told you last week. Your womb is moody, your bladder's a hostage, and your stomach flips at the sight of garlic. But you're doing it, day by day, bite by questionable bite. And every now and then, when you close your eyes and press a hand to your belly, you feel a flutter, like a fish brushing past in a pond. That little movement, that strange knock from the inside, makes all the rules, charms, and weird cheese experiments feel worth it. For now, at least. By now, you're moving through the world like a swollen goddess wrapped in layers of wool, waddling, slightly breathing heavily, and praying the baby stays put just a little longer. Every day brings you closer to that final moment, when labour begins and the ancient dance of birth takes over. But before any screaming or pushing, there's one more ritual left, preparing the birthing chamber. And trust me, it's not just about fluffing the pillows. First, let's be clear, the birthing chamber isn't some sterile whitewashed hospital room with soothing music and adjustable lighting. It's a room in your home, or your lord's manor, or a corner of your peasant cottage, transformed into a sanctified, secluded space. Once you cross the invisible line from expecting to ready to birth, the rules of the world outside no longer apply. You are now in a realm governed by women, superstition, and sweat. Step 1. Darkness. That's non-negotiable. Medieval midwives were big believers in shutting out the outside world. Windows are covered, curtains drawn, doors closed, locked, maybe even barred. Not because of modesty, although that plays a part, but because light was thought to distract or even scare the baby. You want the child to feel safe, to slide out into a soft womb-like environment. Dim light mimics the womb, plus it helps keep out evil spirits, which were always lurking, waiting for a weak point, like sunlight on bare skin, obviously. Step 2, heat and keep the fire going, stoke it high. The room must be warm, not for comfort, but because cold was considered a killer. Cold air could shock the mother. Cold could make the blood congeal. Cold might even trap the baby inside, make it hesitant to come out. So the hearth burns constantly, filling the air with smoke and the smell of damp logs. If you don't have a fireplace, then coals in a basin will do. Blankets are hung over doorways, drafts are chased away with bundles of herbs stuffed into the cracks of windows. Then there's scent. The birthing room must smell right, calm, protective, maybe even sacred. Lavender, sage, rosemary and wormwood are common. These herbs are burned, hung in bundles, or steeped in bowls of hot water. The midwife might wave a smoking braid of herbs around the bed, muttering a proactive prayer as she goes. You breathe it in, whether it calms you or just makes your nose itch depends on the day. And here's where the sacred meets the practical. Holy icons, statues of saints, especially St. Margaret, who's become your unofficial emotional support buddy, are placed near the bed. Maybe someone hangs a rosary over the headboard. Maybe there's a small vial of holy water on the nightstand. If you're lucky, someone's brought a scrap of cloth blessed by a priest. That gets tucked under your pillow. A prayer is whispered. A candle is lit. The room is now prepared. And, most importantly, no men allowed. Seriously, none. Not even your husband. This is a women-only zone, a closed circle, and it's not just tradition, it's protection. Medieval culture believed that the presence of men during birth could upset the mother's emotional balance, interfere with the process, or worse, attract evil. The birthing chamber is feminine space, ruled by midwives and female kin, not by scholars or clergy or anxious men wringing their hands in the next room. Honestly, for everyone's sake, it's better that way. So who is allowed inside? First and foremost, the midwife. She's the queen of the chamber, with years, maybe even decades of experience under her belt. She's not university trained, she hasn't studied in Paris or Bologna, but she's delivered hundreds of babies, knows what every cry means, and can tie a birthing knot with one hand while holding a basin in the other. She knows which herbs reduce bleeding, which prayers calm fear, and which neighbours are more likely to faint than help, alongside her helpers. Women from your family, the village, or the household. Some will boil water, not for cleanliness really, but for heat and humidity. Some will hold your hand or your head. One might prepare broth or warm wine, another will catch the baby. You may not even know all their names, but in this moment, they become your world. And they all have jobs. One might be assigned to rub your back with oil, another to fan you if the heat becomes too much, another to clean up anything unpleasant. It's a kind of choreographed chaos, a centuries-old performance that plays out in candlelight and low murmurs. No one raises their voice unless necessary. The room is filled with hushed encouragement, sacred rhythm, and the occasional clatter of a dropped wooden spoon. There's also the matter of furniture, or lack thereof. You're not lying flat on a cushioned bed. More likely you're on a simple mattress, or seated on a special birthing stool with a gap in the middle for, well, obvious reasons. Sometimes a rope is hung from the ceiling or rafters for you to grip during contractions. You might squat, you might kneel, you might crawl and scream and throw a wooden bowl across the room. The midwife has seen it all. One fringe practice, especially among some northern European groups, involves smearing butter or goose fat on your belly and thighs to ease the baby's passage. It smells terrible. It's slippery. But apparently someone's grandmother swore by it in 1263. So here we are. And all the while, as you breathe and grunt and curse and pray, someone is singing. That's right, singing. Some traditions call for lullabies to be sung before the baby arrives, to encourage them out into a world that already loves them. Other chants are directed at you, soft rhythms to match your breathing, to ground you in the storm. These are not trained sopranos. These are cracked voices, hoarse from fire smoke and years of surviving winters, but they carry you. Even the timing of birth is debated. Some midwives believe that birthing at night is safer, more natural, more private. Others prefer daytime, when the sun can shine on the baby as they enter the world, chasing off shadowy spirits. But ultimately no one gets to choose. When the baby decides it's time, it's time. By now your body knows. Your belly is tight as a drum, your joints ache. The baby shifts low, low, lower. The women begin to whisper less and move more. Cloths are laid out, towels warmed. A clean knife placed near the bed, not for violence, but for cutting the umbilical cord, or occasionally for ritual purposes. In some places, it's believed that the presence of iron wards off evil, so the knife sits there, just in case. You may be terrified. You probably are. But you're also surrounded by women, by ritual, by centuries of knowledge passed down in quiet kitchens and firelit halls. This chamber, dim and hot and fragrant with rosemary and smoke, is your world now. You're about to enter the unknown. And the door has just been shut. The air in the chamber is thick. Part heat, part smoke, part something else entirely. It smells like rosemary and sweat, like old wood and new fear. Outside, the village keeps moving, goats bleating, carts creaking over muddy roads, someone laughing too loudly near the well. But in here, the world has shrunk to four walls and a rising tide of pain. And at the centre of it all, you, breath short, back aching, belly hardening in waves like some unseen tide is pulling you apart from the inside. And now it's time to meet the woman who's going to catch your baby and hopefully keep you alive, the midwife. Let's get one thing straight. This isn't some kindly old grandmother with knitting needles and a soft voice, although she might look like one. This is a professional in the medieval sense of the word. She's been present at more births than anyone can count, has probably delivered her own siblings, children and grandchildren. She doesn't have a license or a diploma, but she has something arguably more useful: experience and a high tolerance for screaming. Midwives in the Middle Ages were almost exclusively women. They had to be. Not just because birth was women's work, but because modesty laws and religious views made male involvement deeply taboo. Most women wouldn't even speak of pregnancy around men, much less let one into a birthing room. The midwife was not only trusted, she was essential. She knew how to check the baby's position using only her hands. She knew the signs of a good labour, and more importantly, the signs of a bad one. She also came equipped, not with a stethoscope or a beeping monitor, but with a bundle of cloths, a small knife, some herbs, a bit of string, a few coins for luck, and knowledge you couldn't find in a book, because books were written by men, and most of them thought the uterus was shaped like a wine bottle. Now, not every midwife was the same. Some were known for their gentle hands, others for their fierce prayers, and a few for their willingness to try unorthodox methods, like hanging a saint medal from your left toe, or whispering sacred words into your ear between contractions. In many places, the community midwife was a semi-mystical figure. Not quite a healer, not quite a priest, but something in between. Part mother, part witch, part battlefield medic. And she did more than deliver babies. She served as counsellor, therapist, and priest in a pinch. She might help with fertility issues, offer potions to bring on labour, or stop it, and prepare the dead when things went wrong. The midwife stood at the beginning and end of life. People whispered about her behind her back, not out of scorn, but because anyone who straddled life and death had often started to feel a little too close to the divine. Midwives had to walk a tightrope, too good at their job, and they were accused of witchcraft, too many losses, and they were whispered about as cursed. Some were respected, others were feared. A few even got pulled into the church courts for performing rituals or charms that made the clergy nervous. After all, when a woman starts drawing symbols on a birthing stool and calling on St. Bridget and the moon goddess in the same breath, someone's going to notice, but mostly midwives were simply there, when no one else was. They arrived with rolled-up sleeves and calm eyes, tied their aprons, and got to work. They'd seen it all. Babies born in silence, babies born shrieking, babies born still. And they didn't flinch. In some towns, midwives had to swear oaths before the local bishop, promises to keep the secrets of the women they served, to not use unholy methods or participate in abortions, though the definition of that changed wildly depending on who you asked, to baptize a dying infant if no priest could be found, which means midwives sometimes found themselves holding a wet, gasping baby over a basin of water, whispering sacred words with shaking hands, trying to save a soul before the breath left it. And yet, for all this responsibility, they were rarely given respect equal to their role. Midwives were women working with women, outside the control of the male-dominated church and the medical establishment. That made people nervous. And nervous people make rules, like midwives must report any strange birthmarks or deformities, like they must never recite pagan words, even if the woman in labour begs for her grandmother's birth prayer. But in the chamber, with your hair stuck to your face and your knees drawn up, you don't care about church politics. You care that the midwife knows how to tell the difference between normal pain and the kind that means something's wrong. You care that she speaks in a low, confident voice, never raising it unless the baby's coming right now. You care that she's touched your wrist, checked your belly and said, "It's soon, but not yet." Her hands are strong, her eyes are tired. She smells faintly of mint and ashes. She presses a warm cloth to your back, murmurs something that might be a prayer or might just be noise. You grip her wrist during the next contraction and she doesn't flinch, just keeps whispering. If things go wrong, she'll know. If you start bleeding too much, or the baby turns, or the labour stalls for hours, she'll call in extra help. Sometimes that means another midwife, sometimes it means a priest, and sometimes, if it is bad enough, it means preparing you for the worst. That quiet moment when everyone realises this birth might only bring one of you out alive, but you're not there yet. Right now, the pain is rhythmic, manageable. The baby hasn't crowned, but it's coming. The midwife checks the cord, rearranges your position, places a protective charm near the bed, not because it works, necessarily, but because it can't hurt. She tells the girl at the fire to prepare the next batch of towels. She tells the woman holding your hand to swap out the cool cloth on your forehead. She reminds you softly that you've done everything right. She doesn't need diagrams or degrees. She doesn't need to look at the stars or consult a manuscript written by a man who's never seen a pregnant woman. She has instinct, practice, memory. Her knowledge comes not from a scroll, but from 1,000 nights like this one, and in the flickering candlelight, as your body begins its slow surrender to the inevitable, the midwife stays near. She is the constant. She knows the blood, the screaming, the silence. She knows when to speak and when not to. She knows the sound of a healthy cry and the weight of a still body. In this chamber, she is the one you trust, and with any luck, she'll be the first person your baby ever sees. Just when you think you've gotten the rhythm of this strange, ancient ritual, breath, pain, breath again, your body swaying like a worn-out bell between contractions, a new presence arrives at the edge of the room. He wears robes. He smells faintly of ink, sweat, and superiority. He's carrying a leather satchel full of things that rattle ominously, and despite all tradition, despite the fact that every woman in the room instantly stiffens when they see him, he's here because someone, probably your husband or a nervous noble relative, sent for a physician. A man, a university-trained, Latin-quoting, diagram-drawing, probably never touched a pregnant woman physician. Congratulations, your birth has officially become a medical event. The presence of male physicians in childbirth during the later Middle Ages marked a major shift, and not necessarily a welcome one. For centuries, women had handled all things related to birth. Midwives ruled the space, and their knowledge was passed down orally, woman to woman. But then universities began to rise, and medicine became a matter of degrees and Latin grammar. And suddenly, men who'd never even seen a uterus in person were calling themselves experts on childbirth. It's important to understand just how far away these men were from the messy, living reality of birth. Their knowledge came from books based on ancient Greek and Roman texts, often centuries old, many translated through Arabic, and full of phrases like "the womb is a cold, moist place influenced by the stars." They dissected pigs and wrote about humans. They diagrammed imaginary uteruses that looked like bellows or inverted jugs. And they genuinely believed that menstrual blood was a form of poison the body needed to purge. Yet despite all this, they were given authority. Why? Because they were men, educated men. And in a world where the church dictated truth and literacy was power, that counted for a lot. When a physician entered a birthing room, it was usually because something had gone wrong, or someone feared it might. He wouldn't be present during normal deliveries. No, he was summoned when the labour stalled, or the baby was breech, or the mother started bleeding more than seemed normal. He wouldn't necessarily touch you, at least not at first. Often, he'd stand at the edge of the room, interrogating the midwife like a disapproving schoolmaster. How long has she been in labour? When did the waters break? Is there blood? Has the baby moved? He might not look at you at all, just speak about you, while the women who've been at your side for hours grit their teeth. To be fair, some of these men truly meant well. They'd studied in Paris or Salerno or Bologna, and they believed deeply that their knowledge could save lives. And sometimes it did, but their tools were limited, their theories even more so, and the way they barged into this deeply feminine sacred space made them unwelcome guests. One of the stranger facts: physicians didn't always see the women they were treating. Modesty rules were so strict that many medieval doctors practiced through the curtain. They'd reach behind a veil or speak instructions while the midwife did the actual work. In one account, a male doctor examined a woman's swollen belly by gently poking through a hole in the curtain like some weird medieval puppet show. And when they did get involved physically, it wasn't always helpful. One method involved manually turning a breech baby by reaching inside the womb. Not great when you've never done it before and your hands aren't even clean. Some carried horrifying instruments, long forceps that looked more like fireplace tongs, sharp hooks for removing stillborn infants, and clamps for assisting the head through the birth canal. These tools were rarely used unless things were already going terribly wrong. But just knowing they were in the room made everyone's shoulders rise an inch. Then there were the treatments. A common one was bloodletting. Yes, in the middle of labour, because obviously what a woman who's losing blood needs is more blood loss. Some physicians applied poultices made of crushed herbs and vinegar to the mother's belly. Others recommended applying warm wine compresses to the thighs. One particularly odd method involved placing a live weasel near the birthing stool. Don't ask. It was meant to draw out the child through magical sympathy. The weasel probably didn't enjoy it either. The midwives hated all of this, of course. To them, the presence of a physician was an intrusion, not just physically, but symbolically. It signaled that their authority could be overwritten, that their experience could be dismissed by someone quoting Aristotle. And many of them had seen the worst-case scenarios. The doctors who cut too deeply, intervened too soon, or treated the birthing woman like a faulty machine instead of a person on the edge of life. There was tension, always. The midwife whispering comfort in your ear while the physician barked Latin diagnoses no one in the room understood. The helpers glaring at the man by the door while he scribbled notes in his ledger, as if your contractions were an academic experiment. The mother, caught in the middle, trying to breathe, trying to push, trying to stay alive, and here's the scholarly debate that still lingers. Was this shift progress or theft? Did male physicians bring life-saving techniques to childbirth? Or did they push women out of a space they had safely governed for centuries? There's no simple answer. Yes, some medical knowledge saved lives, but much of it came at the cost of eroding women's power over their own bodies. In many parts of Europe, especially in cities, this transition accelerated over the next few centuries. Midwives were increasingly regulated. They had to swear loyalty to the church. They were watched, controlled, written about. Their work was dissected by men who never once cleaned up the aftermath of a birth. But in your little chamber, on this particular night, the dynamic is more personal. The physician says his piece. He watches you for a while. He mutters something about the position of the moon. He touches your belly with 2 fingers and frowns. And then, thankfully, he leaves. The midwife rolls her eyes. She unties a cloth pouch and offers you a sip of bitter root tea. She whispers, "You're fine. That man couldn't birth a goat." The women chuckle. The tension breaks. The fire crackles louder. You shift your weight. The contraction builds again, and your world narrows back to breath, pain, breath. And this time no one else speaks. It begins slowly, like a distant drumbeat beneath your skin, tightening across your belly, then fading, then tightening again. The midwife glances over. She knows. Everyone in the room knows. The time has come. Labour has begun in earnest. And while you've spent months preparing, eating the right foods, sleeping on the correct side, avoiding cursed animals and suspicious moon phases, there is no charm or chant that can soften what's coming. The pain rolls in like a tide, deeper and heavier each time. Your body is no longer your own. It's a forge, a furnace, a battlefield. And somewhere inside, a tiny, insistent passenger is making their way down, whether you're ready or not. This is the part of childbirth that terrified people most in the Middle Ages. not just because of the pain, but because of what it symbolized. Labour wasn't just physical, it was moral, even cosmic. The church told you often and clearly, this pain is your punishment. A direct inheritance from Eve, for that one bite of fruit too many centuries ago. Never mind that the theological math makes no sense. You're a woman, and therefore this is your cross to bear, and bear it you do. As the contractions rise, so do the rituals. Someone lights another candle, a tall one said to burn away fear. The midwife anoints your belly with warmed oil, probably olive, maybe goose fat if that's what was on hand. She whispers to the baby as if coaxing them out, "Come, little one, the world is ready." Someone else begins to recite Psalm 23 softly under her breath. The Lord is your shepherd, but tonight he's more of a very silent bystander. And what of the pain? No relief, none at least in the way we understand it today. There are no epidurals, no morphine drips, no quiet beeping machines to track your contractions. What you have is sweat and willpower, and if you're lucky, a few herbs. The medieval pain management options were a mix of mild sedatives and outright nonsense. You might be given a drink made of poppy seeds and wine, which would dull your senses if not knock you out completely. Mandrake root was another go-to, though everyone knew it had a narrow window between eases pain and you stopped breathing. Valerian, chamomile and motherwort were more gentle, steeped into a bitter tea, then forced between your clenched teeth mid-contraction. One midwife might wave rosemary over your head. Another might tie a charm around your thigh made of red thread and chicken bones. Was it effective? Who knows? But it made the helpers feel useful, and it gave you something else to focus on besides the feeling that your spine was about to walk out of your body. Let's not forget the biting stick. In some regions, a woman in labour would be handed a smooth carved piece of wood, or sometimes leather, to clamp between her teeth. To prevent screaming? Maybe. To stop her from biting her own tongue? Possibly. One midwife insisted it was to ground the spirit during agony, whatever that means. Some poor souls bit down so hard they cracked teeth. Better that than your jaw, I guess. But as the hours stretch and the pain becomes your only reality, you begin to understand the strange trance of dubbed. It's not just physical, it's a mental storm. You hallucinate, you forget where you are. You call out for your mother, your childhood pet, St. Margaret, or just God, loudly and repeatedly. And still the women don't flinch. This isn't new to them. They've heard every prayer, every curse, every whispered confession and sob. They stay close. One wipes your face, another rubs your lower back, and the midwife, cool and collected, tells you again and again you're not dying. Though, let's be honest, part of you is not convinced. Medieval people knew this moment was dangerous. They weren't naive. They watched sisters, mothers, neighbours bleed out in quiet beds every year. They'd built entire theologies around the likelihood of death in childbirth. Some women even gave last rites before going into labour, just in case. And if you did die and your baby survived, people called it noble, holy, a kind of martyrdom. There were even songs written about it. One fringe belief insisted that if a woman confessed her sins during labour, her pain would be lessened. Another said if she failed to confess and died, her soul might be stuck in purgatory till someone finished the confession for her, as if the stakes weren't already high enough. And then there were the helpers, who insisted your pain was due to a curse. Perhaps someone envied your fertility. Perhaps a jealous neighbour buried a hexed egg near your garden. In one bizarre case, a woman's labour was said to stall for days until a wise woman discovered a poppet, basically a tiny cloth doll buried near the hearth, burned it. The baby came out 20 minutes later. Total coincidence? Maybe. But in a world with no microscopes, you work with the tools you have, and if labour stalled for too long, things could get desperate. The midwife might try to reposition the baby by hand, a risky, painful, and not always successful manoeuvre. She might give you stronger herbs to urge the womb. Or she might call for the dreaded birthing stool again, raising you up, hoping gravity would do what prayers had not. Some even believed that whispering your child's name, if you'd chosen one, could help draw them out. So there you are, panting, sobbing, whispering the name Thomas or Alice over and over, like a woe, like a plea. Meanwhile, outside the chamber, your husband paces, or prays, or drinks. Maybe he's gone hunting, or maybe he's waiting just outside the door, listening for the first cry, or the silence that might follow. Inside, time stops meaning anything. The fire has burned down to red coals. Your skin is slick with sweat. Your hair clings to your neck. Your thighs shake. You think the pain can't get worse until it does. Then suddenly, everything shifts. A cry goes up, soft but urgent. It's time. The women move fast now. Towels, water, hands, voices. The midwife takes her place, eyes sharp, hands steady. Someone supports your back, someone holds your leg. There is no dignity in this moment, only raw instinct and pain and breath. You bear down again and again, and the room echoes with your cries. The pressure is unbearable, the stretch indescribable, and then a rush, a relief, and a moment of absolute stillness. And then a cry, not yours, the baby, your baby, alive. And though your body is wrecked, your mind barely tethered to this world, something in you begins to return. The pain hasn't stopped. There's still work to do, but the worst part is behind you. Or so you hope. There's a sound you'll never forget, even in the centuries to come. It splits the air like a blade through silk, a high, wet, gasping wail, the baby's first cry. Raw and defiant roars, as if they're scolding the universe for forcing them out of a warm, dark world and into this noisy, smoky, utterly confusing place. And around you there's movement, voices, water sloshing, and the midwife saying something you can't quite hear. But that cry, that one sound slices through the fog in your brain and anchors you back in your body. And what body it is now, wrecked, shaking, empty in ways you didn't expect. You've just given birth in a room without heat regulation, sterile gloves or epidurals. You've screamed and bled and clawed your way through hours, maybe days, of labour with nothing more than a wet rag and a handful of herbs. So let's take a moment and be clear. You've survived something very few people then or now could do without help. And for medieval women, the odds weren't generous. But in this rare, tender moment, the room shifts from tension to something softer. You might not feel joy yet. Joy comes later. But there's relief. Awe. Maybe even laughter. Someone's sobbing quietly. One of the older women kisses your forehead and murmurs, "Brave girl." A phrase so simple but sacred in a space where bravery doesn't wear armour. Just blood and exhaustion. Now comes the clean-up. And no, this isn't the part they put in tapestries. First, the cord. The umbilical cord, which had been feeding and oxygenating your baby this whole time, is clamped and cut. Not with scissors, but probably with a knife heated by the fire or a piece of broken pottery sharpened into a blade. The midwife ties it off with thread or a strip of linen, sometimes stained with prayers inked on days earlier. In some places, it's customary to save a piece of the cord, tied in cloth and tucked into a box, for luck or future healing, or to guard the child against curses. Super gross, but also somehow kind of sweet. Then the baby is rubbed down, not bathed, not yet, but wiped with warm cloths. They might be swaddled tightly right away or allowed a few bare moments on your chest, depending on where you are and who's attending. Skin-to-skin contact wasn't exactly a medieval medical mandate, but midwives with instinct, and there were many, often recognised the calming power of that first embrace. Your baby might be covered in vernix, still slick with blood, and yet to open their eyes fully, you don't care. They're warm, they're real, they're here, but you're not done, because here comes the afterbirth. A thing that medieval writers rarely mentioned in polite company. The placenta must come out, and that's a whole second act of labour. The midwife presses your belly, encourages you to bear down again, and the cord is tugged gently. If it comes out quickly, that's a good sign. If not, well, things get complicated. A retained placenta could mean infection, fever, death, so you pray silently or aloud to whoever is listening that your body will just do this one last thing right, and when it does, the midwife inspects it. Yes, really. They examine the placenta for size, colour, tears. It was considered important to make sure nothing was left behind. Some even believed the placenta had a twin-like bond to the baby, protective, almost sentient. In some traditions, it was buried ceremonially. In others, it was burned or tossed into running water to wash away pain. In one region, mothers were encouraged to spit on it 3 times to ward off evil spirits. Medieval healthcare, now with 60% more superstition. Pain still lingers in your body. The contractions may be less violent now, but they haven't stopped. The uterus is contracting again, slowly beginning the process of shrinking back to something closer to its original size. There's bleeding, steady, messy, and expected. One woman begins to change the linens beneath you. Another removes the blood-soaked pads, which were likely just folded rags of linen or wool, and replaces them with fresh ones. There's no plastic, no absorbent gel, just cloth and hope, and then the midwife checks you. Are you torn, Bleeding too much? Do you feel faint? She watches your eyes. She touches your pulse. If you've torn, she may try to stitch you up, not with surgical thread, but with a needle and coarse linen or silk, sterilised only by proximity to the fire. Some midwives were surprisingly skilled at this, others did more harm than help. There's no anaesthetic, you bite your lip and endure it. At some point, between the afterbirth and the linen changing, the tea sipping and the murmured prayers, someone wraps the baby more tightly and lays them in your arms. They're tiny, red-faced, swaddled like a sausage. Their fists twitch against the cloth. Their mouth opens and closes as if dreaming already. You stare down, dazed, maybe unsure whether this is even real. And then, instinctively, your body begins to shift again. Your breasts ache, your womb pulses, and the midwife encourages you to nurse. This is more than feeding, it's sacred. In many regions, the first milk, colostrum, was called witch's milk, believed to hold magical or healing properties. Some midwives even collected a few drops to rub on the baby's forehead as protection. If the child suckled well, it was seen as a good omen. If they struggled, someone might whisper that it meant future stubbornness. Either way, those first moments of nursing were intimate and intense. And what about pain relief now? Well, not much changes. You might be given a broth, thick and salty, to replenish your strength. Maybe wine, if it's available. A tea of nettle or motherwort to stop bleeding. A piece of bread dipped in honey, not for healing, but to remind you that life still contains sweetness. Then there are the blessings. The women gather. The midwife holds your hand. Someone offers a prayer, not always to the church's liking, but powerful all the same. It might be for your recovery, for the baby's future, for protection against the creeping sickness, or the turning fever, or a dozen other phrases that mean please don't die in the next few days. And despite all of this, the pain, the mess, the terror, you feel a strange clarity settling in. You did it. You passed through the narrow place. You entered the fire and came out holding life. You may be exhausted, bleeding, trembling, but you are still here. And so is the tiny, squirming miracle beside you. The room is quieter now. The fire burns low. The herbs have stopped smoking. Someone opens a window just a crack, and cool air slips in like a whispered promise. The danger isn't over. Infection, fever, blood loss, they're still possible. But right now, in this moment, you are safe, and your child is breathing. The baby is breathing. You're breathing. And for the first time in what feels like a lifetime, the room begins to settle. There's no applause, no grand announcement. Just a collective oi, a rustle of fabric, the hush of quiet tears, and the midwife finally leaning back on her heels, rolling her shoulders like someone who's been carrying the weight of 2 lives on her spine. Which, to be fair, she has. The women move through the room in slow, deliberate gestures now. No rush, no shouting, just the practiced choreography of recovery. But as calm sets in, someone rises quietly and heads toward the door. It's time to call the priest. This might feel like a strange next step, summoning a holy man into this intimate, exhausted space, but in the medieval world, there was a reason for everything. The baby, still slick with birth and swaddled tightly in linen, isn't just a child. They're an unbaptized soul, a blank slate, and that's dangerous. Not to you necessarily, but to them, because according to the church, your child is born with original sin baked into their tiny, wrinkled self. And if something were to happen before baptism, well, let's just say purgatory was the best case scenario. So yes, the priest is called, not necessarily for a name day celebration, but for a race against time. Infant mortality rates were terrifyingly high in medieval Europe. Some historians estimate that as many as 1 in 3 babies didn't make it to their first birthday. In many villages, it was common for women to have 6 or 7 children and see only 2 survive into adulthood. Illness, infection, bad air, malnourishment, take your pick. There was no shortage of ways for a newborn to slip quietly back into whatever strange place they came from. And the church had thoughts. So many thoughts. Baptism was the spiritual firewall. It sealed the child to God, marked them as Christian, and, according to doctrine, ensured their soul would reach heaven if they died. Without it, things were murky. Theological debates raged, quietly and often in Latin, about the fate of unbaptized infants. Some believed they went to limbo, a place without suffering but also without joy. Others argued they were denied heaven altogether. Either way, no one wanted to risk it. So baptism was urgent, sometimes within hours, sometimes minutes. Now, if the priest wasn't available, or you lived too far out in the countryside to fetch one in time, The midwife herself might perform the baptism. This was actually encouraged by church law. Any Christian could baptize in an emergency, as long as the proper formula was used. I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Water had to be poured over the baby's head, preferably holy water, but in a pinch. Well water or wine would do, even snow, if it came to that. One recorded case describes a baby being baptized with tears, another with milk. The important thing wasn't the substance, it was the intention. This rite, performed by tired, blood-splattered women in dimly lit chambers, often took place before the father had even seen the child. Sometimes it was done in silence, sometimes it was sung, occasionally a candle was lit, the flame passed near the infant's face, symbolizing Christ's light. In wealthier homes, the baptism might wait a few days, long enough to arrange a proper ceremony at the parish church. But that was risky, very risky. Many families preferred to baptize immediately, then follow up later with the more formal event. You know, just in case heaven needed proof of paperwork. And while the priest was here, he might also offer churching, a blessing for the mother, a sort of spiritual re-entry after birth. This wasn't mandatory, but it was common. Technically, it wasn't a cleansing, but it felt like one. Women who had bled, screamed, and passed through what was considered unclean were ritually welcomed back into the community. The priest would pray over you, sprinkle holy water, and read from scripture. You'd kneel, head bowed, while your knees ached and your stitches pulled. A small ceremony for a big journey. But let's not pretend this was always a smooth or joyful moment. There was anxiety. What if the baby had trouble breathing? What if the midwife suspected something wasn't quite right? Some newborns were baptized while barely alive. Quiet, blue-tinged, unmoving. These were called emergency baptisms, and they were sobering. The midwife might dip her fingers in water and whisper the sacred words while the mother wept, not knowing if she'd be mourning by nightfall. In some cases, babies were baptized in the same basins where the placenta had been washed. The line between sacred and survival was razor thin. Naming happened at baptism too. In fact, you didn't really have a name until that moment. The midwife or priest would speak it aloud, chosen from saints, family lineage, or hopeful virtues. No middle names, no creativity, just John, Agnes, Mary, Thomas, occasionally charity, fortitude, or faith. Naming a child after a saint wasn't just tradition, it was protection. You wanted someone in heaven with a vested interest in keeping your kid alive. Some even believed the saint would guide the child's life, whispering wisdom, or, if ignored, causing mysterious fevers, no pressure. And what if you had a stillbirth? What if the baby never cried, never breathed? This was one of the great unspoken wounds of medieval life. Unbaptized stillborns couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. They weren't allowed a Christian burial. Some were interred quietly outside churchyards, in hidden corners or limbo fields. There were whispers of secret baptisms, unrecorded rituals, even superstitious attempts to revive a baby just long enough for baptism. Holding them near a fire, flicking water, a desperate attempt to grant the child what theology demanded. In some places, little wooden tokens or crosses were buried with stillborns, a silent protest against official doctrine. The grief was immense, silent but immense, and for the mother, that grief came with guilt. Had she eaten something wrong? Had she dreamed of fire? Had she failed to say a prayer? No one said it aloud, but they all thought it. If the baby did live, then the first days were a flurry of protection. No strange visitors, no loud noises, no leaving the house. Some mothers didn't let their babies be seen in sunlight for the first week, fearing jealous eyes or wandering spirits. Amulets were tucked into blankets. Saint medals were hung above cradles. In some homes, an iron nail was hammered into the threshold to ward off curses. Nothing says welcome home like a bit of medieval paranoia, but beneath all the ritual, all the fear, all the superstition, there was something beautifully human. A mother, a child, a sacred breath between them. Whether the priest came or not, whether the rite was performed in Latin, or muttered half asleep in the dark, the act of baptism was, at its core, an act of hope, a way of saying this child matters, this life deserves blessing. And as you sit, aching but alive, holding your warm, sleeping baby, the last words of the baptism still echo softly in the room, in nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Just when you think you're through the worst of it, when the baby is swaddled and the fire is down to a flicker, and someone's finally given you a cup of watered wine to sip, just when your breath slows and your body begins to unclench, Someone says it. Not loudly, not dramatically. Maybe it's the midwife. Maybe it's your mother. Maybe it's just the woman sitting at your feet, wiping blood from the floor with an old linen towel. But the words hang in the air like smoke. What if something goes wrong now? Because this is the moment in medieval childbirth where the real terror begins. Not the screaming and tearing and chanting, not the biting stick or the prayers shouted over your sobs. No, this part is quieter and much more dangerous, because now you're exhausted, you're raw, open, vulnerable, and this is when things go terribly wrong. There are stories, every village has them. The mother who gave birth at dawn and was dead by dusk. The one who bled out before anyone noticed the sheets were soaked through. The one who whispered that her stomach hurt, then was cold by morning. Women who survived the storm of labour only to slip away quietly, as if the door that opened to let life in had accidentally left death wide open behind it. So let's talk about what actually went wrong and what people thought was going wrong. The most obvious danger, hemorrhage. You've just lost a lot of blood. In a normal delivery, even one that goes perfectly, blood loss is significant. In one that doesn't, it's catastrophic. And with no understanding of blood volume, no transfusions and no antiseptics, there's nothing to stop it except pressure, prayers, and the hope that your body remembers what to do. Midwives might pack the birth canal with cloths. They might apply cold compresses, or hot ones. They might rub your belly with oil, muttering to St. Margaret, asking her to seal the womb. But if your body keeps bleeding, that's it. Then there's infection. Though no one had a microscope or even a basic understanding of bacteria, they knew something was up when the mother developed a fever days later, shivering, sweating, her body trembling with heat. In modern terms, we call it puerperal fever, or childbed fever. In medieval terms, it was called the rotting sickness, and it killed thousands. And here's the horrifying part. It was often passed by the very people trying to help, the midwife who touched one woman, then another, without washing her hands. The cloths reused between births, the knife used to cut the cord still sticky with blood. They didn't know better. They didn't know worse either. They just kept going. And sometimes that meant bringing death right into the bed where life had just arrived. One fringe remedy involved burning herbs directly on the floor of the birthing room after labour, to purify the air, they said. Another required placing garlic cloves under the bed, or tying them to the woman's ankles. Some believed that drawing a circle of ash around the bed could keep fever away. Others insisted that singing psalms at specific hours of the day, especially just before dusk, would ward off the creeping illness. And if none of that worked, well, they'd call the priest again. There was also the danger of a retained placenta. If it didn't come out completely, if even a small piece was left behind, it could lead to infection, fever, death. Some midwives knew the signs, others didn't. One old remedy instructed the mother to squat over a pot of steaming herbs to encourage release. Another told her to drink wine steeped with dried nettles. Still another suggested dangling a charm over her belly while the midwife chanted. All of this was desperate improvisation, but let's not pretend it was always gentle. Sometimes the midwife reached in herself, with her bare hand, with no pain relief, no guarantees, just hope and will and grit. Then there's eclampsia. They didn't have a word for it, but they'd seen it. The mother who seized after birth, her body convulsing, her eyes rolling back, they thought it was possession or a bad omen. In reality, it was blood pressure spiking to lethal levels, but they had no idea. So they held the woman down, prayed over her, tied ribbons to her wrists, and sometimes they sang. Other dangers were subtler. The mother who stopped eating, who refused to speak, who couldn't sleep or couldn't stop crying. Today we'd call it postpartum depression. Back then, maybe melancholia, maybe madness, maybe punishment for some unconfessed sin. Either way, it was treated with isolation, bitter herbs, or sometimes even exorcism. You think I'm exaggerating? I'm not. There were cases of women being locked in rooms to protect the child from their unbalanced humours. One woman was said to have cried for 40 days after the death of her child, and the village believed her tears were cursing the crops. They made her leave. Sent her to live with a cousin, as if grief could be contagious. And even when the mother survived, no fever, no bleeding, no seizures, there were still social dangers. She was expected to return to herself within days, to smile, to mother, to show gratitude. But what if the baby wouldn't nurse? What if the child was sickly or quiet or cried all night? What if the mother felt nothing when she looked at them? No one spoke of those feelings. There was no room for that kind of honesty, so they told stories instead. Stories of women who floated between life and death after birth, of mothers who went walking at night in their shifts, their eyes blank, hair undone, of children who failed to thrive because their mother had seen a ghost. Or worse, because she hadn't. One fringe belief said that if the mother looked at fire too long during labour, her soul might burn and leave her body before the child was born. Another said the mother's spirit lingered beside her bed for 3 days after birth, watching her body to see if it was worth re-entering. And if she felt unloved or unwelcome or afraid, she might drift away. To protect against this, some women were never left alone after birth. One helper would sleep beside her, another at her feet, not just for company, but to keep her soul tethered. It sounds strange, but in a world where medicine failed and religion ruled, these were the ways people tried to fight back. Still, many women made it. You might be one of them. You lie in the bed, a little paler, a little hollowed out, but you're there. Your baby is beside you, wrapped tightly in the same linens used by your mother, your grandmother, her mother, before her. The women in the room speak softly, tidy up, prepare to leave. The midwife gives one last look, eyes sharp, measuring, then nods. You have survived the gauntlet, for now, but the road ahead is long. The child will need to be fed. You'll need to be bled, probably, just to balance the humours. You'll stay in bed for days, maybe weeks, and even then you won't return as the same woman who went in, because once you've stared down death and reached into it to pull out life, you're never quite the same again. The fire has burned low, and the room smells faintly of blood, sweat, and sweet herbs that couldn't quite cover the scent of something much more raw. Outside, the sun is rising, or maybe it's setting, you honestly don't know. Time has collapsed into a blur. You're propped up on scratchy linen pillows that feel like sandpaper against your skin, your body hollowed out and aching, and your baby sleeps beside you, face scrunched, breath soft. Everything is quiet now, which is strange because part of you expected some kind of fanfare. Applause, trumpets, a choir of angels, or at least a bowl of hot stew, but instead it's just this. The women who helped have mostly drifted off back to their own homes, their own beds, their own broths to stir. Only the midwife remains, nodding off in a nearby chair, arms crossed, head tilted forward like someone used to grabbing sleep in stolen moments. She's waiting, of course, for the next step, because not everything in childbirth is loud and dramatic. Some things arrive in silence, like loss. You keep glancing at your baby, not because they're so cute, though yes, in their squished newborn, slightly purple-faced way they're perfect, but because you're watching, counting, noticing every pause between breaths. You've heard the stories, everyone has, about mothers who woke to silence, about babies who slipped away in the night, their tiny lungs never quite catching on to the rhythm of the world. And no one has the answers. Not really. Stillbirth. That's the word they wouldn't say out loud. It carried too much weight, too much fear. But it happened all the time. One moment, a full belly. The next, a quiet room. Some babies were born without ever drawing a breath. Others came too early, too small to survive. Some cried once, then never again. Some mothers weren't even told the truth, just handed a bundled cloth and told to sleep, while the women quietly made arrangements outside. You try not to think about it, but of course you do. There was always a ritual for those lost little ones, though it varied wildly depending on where you lived. In towns with strict priests, stillborns were denied burial in consecrated ground. Not baptized, not part of the church. Their souls, they said, floated elsewhere, not hell, not quite heaven. Limbo, if you were lucky. Some said it was a meadow where unbaptized infants slept under wildflowers. Others said nothing at all, which was somehow worse. In more remote villages, though, people had their own rules. Women took back control. If a baby was born silent, the midwife might wet their head with holy water anyway, whispering the baptismal words just in case. No witnesses, no record, just a quiet insurance policy for a soul no one was willing to let drift away untethered. Sometimes, if the baby was born only just gone, they'd try to wake them, rub their feet, breathe into their mouths, even submerge them briefly in warm water to shock life into their lungs. Most of the time, it didn't work, but hope was stubborn. The body, if not allowed in the churchyard, might be buried under a tree, or near a stream, or beneath the threshold of the family home so the child would always be close. Little markers, stones, ribbons, carvings, were tucked away, unnoticed by the clergy. Secret grief made visible in tiny gestures, and for the mother, the grief was complicated, because you weren't always allowed to grieve, at least not publicly. People were quick with their reassurances. You'll have another. God needed an angel. At least it wasn't older. As if losing a child who hadn't yet spoken made it easier, as if an empty cradle didn't carry just as much weight as one filled with noise. Sometimes women were blamed. You ate the wrong food, you took too many steps, you were angry too often, or worse, you were too sad. Melancholy was thought to infect the womb, to poison the child's growth. So if something went wrong, it must be because you weren't joyful enough. And if you were joyful, perhaps too joyful, perhaps you drew the attention of jealous spirits. Either way, it always seemed to come back to you. Even how you dreamed during pregnancy was examined. Dream of falling? That might be why the baby didn't survive. Dream of fire? That could have marked them. Some midwives asked, after a stillbirth, what the mother had seen in her sleep. Not to comfort her, but to gather data. Dream omens passed down from woman to woman, added to the long, unspoken list of things that might mean loss. And the strangest thing? People didn't speak of these babies again. Not really. Not by name, if they had one. They vanished into silence. You weren't supposed to dwell. Grieve, yes, but quickly, quietly, and then move on. Have another. Get stronger. Pray more, but don't talk about that one. But you do think about them. Every woman does. The babies who didn't make it. The ones born blue and limp, or with cord marks around their necks, or who never opened their eyes. You remember them, even if they weren't yours. Because they could have been. They almost were. One of the older women, maybe the one who wiped your face during labour, tells you about her first. A baby boy born in winter. He never cried. She buried him under the birch tree. And for years afterward, she placed a ribbon around its trunk each spring. She never said his name out loud, not even once. But she remembers the weight of him in her arms. It's not all sorrow, though. There's resilience, too. Women learn to grieve without breaking. They lit candles for the children they lost. They sang lullabies to no one. Some even carved tiny wooden figures and kept them tucked into boxes. One midwife used to say every stillborn child went straight to the arms of St. Anne, who rocked them until the end of days. You don't know if it's true, but it helps. Your baby stirs beside you. They're still breathing, still warm. You try not to cling too tightly, but you do. Because even when everything seems fine, medieval mothers knew better than to assume anything. Hope lived next to fear. Life danced too close to death. And silence was the thing you dreaded most. But for now, your child is safe. Their breath rises and falls. Their face twitches in a dream you can't see. The women will return soon. The midwife will leave. The house will go quiet again. And you'll begin the long, slow journey of motherhood. Still aching. Still grateful. Still haunted. But now with someone to hold. You've survived childbirth. You've survived the days immediately after. And your baby is alive and breathing beside you, already a small miracle. The danger isn't gone, but it's changed. No longer a storm bearing down on you. It's more like a thick fog that lingers in the corners of the room, waiting for something to go wrong. But even as things seem to settle, there's a phrase you overhear in a whisper from one of the older women, a phrase that makes your heart dip just slightly. She didn't survive the cutting. You don't want to ask. You already know. You've heard it before, stories told in hushed voices, never around pregnant women, of what happens when a baby won't come out, when labour drags on for days, when there's screaming and blood and then nothing. That's when someone mentions the knife. Welcome to the medieval caesarean section. Now, first things first. If you're imagining a controlled surgical procedure performed by candlelight with the mother surviving, gently stitched up by an Ivy League trained doctor in velvet robes, forget it. That's a fantasy. In the medieval world, the C-section wasn't a method to save the mother. It was a last resort to save the baby, usually performed only when the mother was already dead or believed to be dying. There were laws, in some places, mandating that a baby be cut from the womb if the mother died during labour. This wasn't about compassion, it was about salvation. The soul of the child mattered more than the body of the woman. If the baby could be removed and baptized in time, that was considered a spiritual victory, even if everything else had gone horribly wrong. Let that sink in for a moment. a law requiring the living to cut open the dead, just in case they could save a soul. These were not sterile operations. They were desperate, brutal procedures performed with whatever blade was available. Kitchen knives, farm tools, or in one recorded case, a sharpened piece of glass. The woman was laid out on a table or the floor, her body still warm, sometimes still bleeding, and the midwife, or whoever was brave enough, made the incision. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, just hands, steel and prayers, and occasionally, just occasionally, they tried it while the woman was still alive. This was extraordinarily rare and usually done out of sheer desperation. A mother trapped in a never-ending labour, a baby stuck, hours, even days of agony. And finally the decision is made: cut her open, save the child, hope the screams don't echo too far into the street. One of the most famous stories whispered across Europe like a cautionary tale was of a midwife who performed a C-section with nothing more than boiling wine and a razor-sharp knife. The mother, already unconscious, somehow lived. The baby too. People called it a miracle, others called it witchcraft. Either way, the midwife disappeared shortly after. No one wanted to be too close to that kind of power. And yes, there are a few recorded cases, scattered and questionable, where the mother actually survived. Not many, but enough to keep the story alive. In these cases, the wound was stitched with catgut or linen thread, the area packed with moss or herbs, and the woman kept near the fire to stave off infection. Some of them lived, most didn't. The church had opinions, of course. The practice was morally supported if the intent was baptism. That was what really mattered. There are written records of monks and priests giving instructions on how to perform a post-mortem C-section to save a soul. One particularly grim manuscript even includes a diagram of a woman's body labelled not with anatomical terms but with Latin prayers to say at each step of the cut. Medicine and theology working hand in shaky hand. Among village women, though, it was a thing of horror. No one wanted to speak of it openly. The idea of your belly being opened after death, or worse, while you were still screaming, was too much. Yet it lived on in stories, passed through generations, a warning, a fear, sometimes whispered during late-night prayers. Keep me safe from the knife. The procedure itself wasn't even called a caesarean until much later. That term misleadingly suggests it comes from Julius Caesar, who, according to legend, was born by being cut from his mother's womb. This is almost certainly false. Caesar's mother, Aurelia, reportedly lived for years after his birth, which would have been impossible if she'd undergone the kind of surgery available at the time. But the legend stuck, and with it the name. Some scholars argue that the practice of cutting infants from the womb dates back to ancient times. But in those eras, as in the medieval one, it was rarely done with any hope for the mother. It was about the baby, about lineage, about baptism, and sometimes, horrifyingly, about access to the child's organs for strange rituals or rare medicines. Yes, really, in fringe cases, the womb itself was thought to hold magical properties, especially after death. Some believe that burning the womb of a woman who died in childbirth and scattering the ashes over a field could increase fertility in the soil. Others claimed that a piece of umbilical cord kept in a pouch could cure infertility. These were not mainstream beliefs, but they persisted in pockets of rural Europe like stubborn moss on stone. And the worst part, there were no guarantees. Even if the incision was made in time, even if the baby was removed, cleaned and baptized, there was no certainty they'd live. The trauma of the procedure, the exposure to cold, the lack of immediate nourishment, it was all stacked against them. More than a few babies died minutes after being saved, leaving behind a motherless body and an exhausted, devastated midwife. Yet the practice endured, not because it worked, but because the alternative was worse: to do nothing, to lose both, to watch life slip away while your hands were still steady, your knife still sharp, your faith still strong enough to try. And so the cut was made, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes in a scream. You lying there now with your baby nestled against your chest are among the lucky ones. No knife, no blood-soaked panic, just the regular kind of suffering. Your womb remains closed. The midwife never even reached for her blade. But you know the stories. You've heard the warnings. The knife was never far, it still isn't. And in the quiet hours of the night, when your child stirs and you pull them closer, your hand brushes your belly, and you whisper a silent thank you for being whole, for being here, for being alive in a world that so often cuts without mercy. Your body is still sore, your legs weak, and your breath comes shallow even when you're just lying still. But the women are moving around you again. They're not fluffing pillows or offering broth. No, this time they're straightening the bedding with more purpose, smoothing your garments, even wiping down the threshold with water and herbs. The midwife adjusts the blanket over the baby, murmurs something to the woman by the fire, and gives you a small, tight smile. You know that look. You're not sure what's coming, but it smells like ritual. It smells like church. Because now, after the blood and the bones and the birthing, comes the part where your soul is evaluated. The part where your pain is reframed not as suffering, but as salvation. The part where, like everything else in your life, the church has something to say about what just happened in that dark, smoky room. That's right. The baby has been baptized. But you're still spiritually unclean. Let's take a breath and talk about that. According to medieval church doctrine, childbirth was both a miracle and a reminder of your sinful nature, a paradox wrapped in swaddling cloth. The act of bringing life into the world was, in theory, noble, but it was also a direct consequence of Eve's disobedience. Genesis 3:16 gets quoted a lot in this era, and you probably heard it at least once during your pregnancy. In pain you shall bring forth children. You didn't just go through labour, you reenacted the fall. Congratulations. Which brings us to churching, the official ritual of purification for women after childbirth. The idea was this: your body, by bleeding and being so close to death and life at once, had become spiritually tainted. Whether your child lived or not, whether the birth was clean or catastrophic, whether you were a saint or a sinner, you needed cleansing before you could return to the community, and the church offered a way back in, sort of like a spiritual reset button, but with more incense and a lingering undertone of judgment. So roughly 30 to 40 days after the birth, longer if you're still bleeding or too weak to walk, you'd be brought to the church, usually accompanied by other women. Your baby might come too, tucked into arms or slings, but the ritual wasn't for them. This was your moment. The churching ceremony was meant to bless your recovery, thank God for your survival, and most of all readmit you into the spiritual life of the church. You know, the one you were gently nudged out of the second your waters broke. The priest would meet you at the door of the church. Not in the church, mind you, because again you were still technically impure until the ritual began. The priest would wear white vestments. You'd wear your best available clothing, even if you still had bruises on your knees and stitches between your legs. A candle might be placed in your hand. You'd be sprinkled with holy water and led in with a prayer of thanksgiving. Some priests made a point to call this a celebration. Others let you know very subtly that this was also a reminder. A reminder that pain is a price, that motherhood, like all things sacred, dawns must be earned. Some churchings were grand, especially among noble women, attended by half the estate with singing and gifts and a feast afterward. These ceremonies became an odd hybrid of spiritual cleansing and social debut. Look, she survived. The baby's here. We can all stop holding our breath now. In some regions, this was also when the mother could first appear in public again. Until then, she might have stayed indoors, secluded, not just for rest, but to avoid contaminating the spiritual and social space. But for poor women, it was simpler. A candle, a quiet prayer, maybe a psalm or two mumbled in bad Latin. No feast, just relief, just a soft, subtle return to life. One midwife might whisper a blessing before you left. Another might press a coin into your palm for luck, she'd say. Everyone knew what it really meant. You made it. You're back. And yes, the ritual carried patriarchal baggage the size of a cathedral. There's no getting around that. It was built on the idea that your body had crossed a line it shouldn't have, even if that line was called motherhood. But for some women, churching was more than a reminder of their impurity. It was closure, a way to mark the end of something terrifying, a way to stand in public in clean clothing and say, I'm still here. Of course, not everyone wanted to be churched. Some resisted, others weren't churched at all because they died before the 40 days were up. And for a small but brave handful of women, the ritual felt like an insult, as if surviving labour, feeding a child from a cracked and aching body, and enduring weeks of bleeding hadn't already made them holy. But the church was everywhere. It wrapped around you like boh. It touched your food, your bed, your name, your birth, your death. It dictated not just how you lived, but how you re-entered life after nearly dying. And then there were the women who had churchings, but no baby to bring with them. That was a different silence. They walked to the church with empty arms and eyes that had seen too much. Their candles flickered harder, their steps dragged, and the prayers, when spoken, were often softer. Some priests omitted the line about rejoicing, some didn't. Either way, these mothers were expected to return to normal, to show up, to kneel, to pray, and then to go back to their homes and start again. Fringe communities had their own way of reclaiming the ritual. Some women would bring a piece of the baby's clothing, a booty, a bonnet. They'd light a candle in their child's name, even if the child had never breathed. Some midwives helped create private churchings, off the books, whispered under breath, with herbs burning instead of incense. There was always a workaround if you knew who to ask. Back in your home, you're not thinking about theology, not really. You're still sore, you're still bleeding a little, but you're also sitting up more now and people are beginning to look at you like you're no longer in the shadow of death. Someone makes a joke about your hair. Someone else refills your cup. Life resumes, gently and awkwardly, like a song that lost its beat and is trying to find the rhythm again. You wonder if the church will say something kind when you go, if the priest will look at you with reverence, or just check off another name from the parish list. You wonder if you'll cry, or laugh, or feel nothing at all. But one way or another, you'll go. You'll stand at that doorway, candle in hand, tired eyes watching the stained glass light. And someone will say, "Welcome back." Your body still aches in places you didn't know could ache. Your back feels like it's been chopped in half and badly stitched together with fishing line. Your feet swell every time you stand, and you're pretty sure your ribcage still hasn't forgiven you. But the baby? The baby is here, alive, red-faced, loud, and now very tightly wrapped. Not in soft modern onesies with cheerful ducklings embroidered on the chest, but in an alarming amount of cloth that looks more like you're preparing them for a long voyage into space. Welcome to the medieval art of swaddling, equal parts practical, questionable, and, depending on who you ask, a form of very early orthopedic torture. Let's be clear, this wasn't just wrapping your baby in a cosy blanket to help them sleep. This was a process, a full-body cocooning ritual with layers upon layers of cloth starting from the neck and going all the way down to the feet. Arms? Tied down. Legs? Straightened and bound. Sometimes the baby's hands were completely immobilized, no fists, no flailing, no access to the face. Why? Because movement was suspect. A flailing baby was seen as unformed, not yet civilized, not yet human in the proper sense. The goal was control. Clean lines, order, and it started immediately. Within hours, sometimes minutes after birth, once the midwife had wiped off the vernix and murmured a few holy words, the baby was swaddled. Not gently, not loosely. They were wrapped up like a miniature mummy, stiff-limbed and wide-eyed. The cloths were tied with small bands of linen, sometimes stitched into place to prevent unravelling. And then, get this, they were often placed on a board or in a cradle with bindings to hold them there. You've heard of a baby monitor. This was a baby stationary unit. Why go to all this trouble? Well, in medieval logic, straight lines made straight people. The belief was that swaddling helped shape the child's bones properly. It prevented crooked limbs, twisted joints, and moral decay. Yes, moral decay. A baby that moved too much might grow up unruly, disobedient, possibly criminal. So naturally, the solution was to turn them into a fabric-wrapped log for most of the day. And we're not talking short stretches either. Babies could be swaddled for 22 or 23 hours a day, with short breaks for feeding and cleaning. They slept swaddled. They were passed around swaddled. Some were even hung on pegs while swaddled, like little wall-mounted sausages to keep them out of harm's way while the mother worked. That image will now live rent-free in your brain forever. You're welcome. As for diapers, not exactly. The swaddling bands doubled as containment systems. Some mothers lined the cloth with moss, wool, or old rags to absorb waste, and when the baby inevitably soiled themselves, the entire wrapping had to be changed. Cue the medieval version of a blowout, only now it's sewn in. Good times. The cradle wasn't always soft or luxurious either. For poor families, it might be a wooden box stuffed with straw or wool scraps. In wealthier homes, babies slept in carved cradles with canopies and painted saints on the side, because nothing says sweet dreams like a martyr bleeding elegantly next to your head. And regardless of wealth, cradles were kept very close to the fire. Warmth was life, cold air was the enemy. If a baby caught a chill, people feared it would settle in the chest and cause death, or worse, grow into a melancholic personality. Now, there's some logic here, buried under layers of linen. Babies do like to be wrapped. Swaddling can soothe them, help with sleep and prevent scratching. And in a world without heating, swaddling was protective. But the medieval version took things to extreme levels. In some regions, it was custom to swaddle babies so tightly their arms wouldn't move for months. That's not comfort, that's a straitjacket, and not everyone agreed with it. Even in the Middle Ages, there were debates. Some physicians, especially those influenced by Arabic medical texts, argued that constant swaddling could cause overheating, sores, or limit development. One text suggested letting the baby move freely during the day and swaddling only at night. But these were radical ideas, and most people weren't about to give up centuries of tightly wound tradition just because some scholar in a dusty robe had a new theory. Fringe practices took swaddling even further. Some mothers oiled the baby's skin with animal fat before wrapping to soften the bones. Others used salt rubs to harden the skin, then wrapped the baby extra tightly to set their shape like clay. In the Alps, there are records of babies being wrapped in bandages soaked in wine, supposedly to encourage warmth and divine favour. It's unclear if the babies enjoyed the aroma, but someone clearly thought it worked. And it wasn't just about the body. Swaddling was spiritual. A wrapped baby was protected from spirits, demons, and the evil eye. Loose-limbed infants were thought to be vulnerable, easy prey. One charm involved sewing a tiny cross into the swaddling cloth near the chest to keep evil away from the heart. Another required the baby's head to be wrapped with 3 turns of thread blessed on St. John's feast day. It looked suspiciously like a fashion statement, but to them it was survival. The baby's face, however, was left uncovered. That was where breath lived, where identity rested, and where midwives and mothers watched for the signs: colour, movement, the little twitches, the faintest flutter of lashes, a hiccup, a sigh. That's how you knew they were still alive, because wrapped as they were, you wouldn't know otherwise. Some mothers placed bells near the cradle, or tied tiny rattles into the swaddling so that if the baby moved, you'd hear it. Death was a silent thing, and if you missed it, you might unwrap your child hours later only to find, well, you don't want to think about that. Despite all this, there was beauty in the ritual too. The care taken, the folding and tying, the quiet conversations whispered while wrapping. Mothers sang lullabies as they swaddled. Sisters watched and learned. Grandmothers reminded you to leave a bit of room at the feet so the child wouldn't grow up with tight soles. There was knowledge in those hands, generational muscle memory. And when the baby finally quieted, eyes fluttering shut, wrapped and warm and safe in your arms or resting by the fire, there was peace, at least for a moment. You glance at them now, your little linen-wrapped mystery, arms pinned, nose twitching. They look like a bundle of laundry, but they're yours, soft and still and entirely dependent. And as strange as it all seems, the cloth around them doesn't feel like confinement. It feels like banama, like tradition. Like all the women who wrapped their babies just like this and whispered the same silent prayers into the same smoky air. Stay warm, stay still, stay alive. There's something about being told to rest that sounds almost pleasant, until you actually try it in a medieval bed with a stitched perineum, leaking breasts, and a baby that has no concept of nighttime. You'd think after 9 months of carrying a human and surviving a childbirth that nearly broke your spine in half, you'd be allowed a little peace. And you are, in theory. Everyone keeps saying it. She must rest, she must lie in. But rest in the medieval sense doesn't mean spa robes and silent meditation. It means you don't leave your bed for a month. Or longer. Welcome to the postpartum period, medieval edition, otherwise known as lying in. Let's begin with the intention behind it. The idea of lying in was based on both medical beliefs and religious customs. Your body after giving birth was seen as weakened, vulnerable, and spiritually fragile. The bleeding, the lochia, though they wouldn't have called it that, was seen as the necessary purging of the bad humours stirred up during pregnancy, so for at least 30 to 40 days you were expected to stay indoors, ideally in bed, wrapped in blankets, kept warm and still, while your body rid itself of whatever evil had built up inside you. Because everything medieval medicine couldn't explain was classified as evil, or wind, or both. The church also chimed in, of course. Until you had been churched, that ritual we covered earlier, you were still considered unclean. Not in a mean you smell like goats way, though, let's be honest, personal hygiene wasn't thriving. No, it was a spiritual impurity. You'd brushed against the veil between life and death. You had blood on your soul, so into bed you went. The world could wait. This sounds comforting at first. After all, modern advice also encourages new mothers to take it slow, to bond with the baby, to heal. But in practice, medieval lying in was less about comfort and more about control. It wasn't about what you needed. It was about what everyone else thought your body represented. You were sacred, yes, but also dangerous, bleeding, exhausted, unpredictable. So the safest thing was to tuck you away until everyone was sure you weren't about to burst into flames or curse the harvest by accident. You stayed in the same room where you gave birth, often the same bed. The fire remained lit, even when the days grew warm, because drafts were believed to invite sickness. If someone forgot to close the window, you might get a chill in the womb, a phrase that sounds fake but was taken very seriously. Your meals were simple: broth, boiled grains, maybe meat if you were lucky, herbs steeped in water, beer sometimes, wine if you had wealth, no raw vegetables, no cold cheese, and absolutely no strong emotions. You were to stay calm, quiet, and emotionally flat. Anything else could disrupt the balance of your humours. And yes, people watched. Your mother, your sisters, your aunts, maybe your neighbours. They took turns feeding you, changing your linens, bringing the baby for feedings, then taking them away again. Sometimes it felt like care. Sometimes it felt like surveillance. One woman watching to make sure you weren't crying too much, another noting how long you held the baby. You were surrounded, yet often lonely. You couldn't go to the market, you couldn't attend mass, you couldn't even stand at the doorway and watch the chickens without someone gasping and herding you back inside. For noble women, this confinement could feel like isolation in a velvet-lined prison. You might have a private room, maybe even one with tapestries and warm bricks for your feet. But you were still cut off. No formal visits, no court appearances. And if your baby had died, the silence in those rooms could stretch endlessly, a month of grieving alone, while everyone whispered just outside the door. For poorer women, the situation was different, but not necessarily easier. Lying in wasn't always realistic when there was bread to bake, water to haul, fields to tend, so the rules bent. You might rest for a few days, if there was someone else to carry the workload. Then you were up again, baby strapped to your chest, bleeding into rags, praying your stitches wouldn't tear while you chased chickens through the mud. But even in those moments, the ritual of lying in existed. It lingered as an idea, a hope, a thing that women talked about even when they couldn't have it. She had a proper lying in, they'd say, meaning she was cared for, meaning she lived through it. One fringe belief claimed that a woman who did not lie in for at least 3 weeks risked her womb falling out. That's right, just popping right out and dragging along behind her like some awful fleshy tail. Doctors, again not the reliable kind, insisted this could be prevented with the proper binding of the belly and the thighs, plus daily herbal teas. The real remedy, of course, was rest, but that was the hardest medicine to come by. During this time, women weren't expected to do much except heal, feed the baby, and remain mostly invisible. Your body was expected to shrink back to its former state. Your bleeding was tracked with a mix of concern and superstition. If it stopped too soon, something was wrong. If it continued too long, you might be cursed, or worse, you might be possessed, because yes, postpartum illness, particularly depression or delirium, was often blamed on demonic interference. One recorded case involved a woman who 10 days after birth began speaking in tongues, flinching at candlelight and refusing to nurse her child. The priest was called, an exorcism was performed. In modern language, she was likely experiencing postpartum psychosis, but in medieval terms, that was the devil, or at least an ambitious local spirit with a grudge. To guard against this, some women wore protective charms, a scrap of linen blessed by a priest tucked into the folds of their gown, a small bone pendant worn on a string around the neck. One tradition involved tying a red ribbon around the wrist of the mother and the baby, symbolically linking their souls during this fragile time. As long as the ribbon stayed in place, both would remain protected. Despite all of this, despite the strange rituals, the fears, the restrictions, some women found comfort in lying in. It was one of the rare times a woman's pain was taken seriously. You were allowed to say you hurt. You were allowed to rest. For a short time, your labor made you important, sacred, powerful. People looked at you differently. They brought you gifts, they called you strong, and then they expected you to get up. One day someone would open the window again. The fire would be allowed to die down. Your baby would be fatter now, louder. Your bleeding would slow. and then you'd be told it was time to return to the world, to cook, to clean, to carry, to be what you were before as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. You had passed through fire and blood and shadow, and though the world didn't change, you had. So you sit for now, wrapped in wool, sipping lukewarm broth, your baby snoring softly beside you. The door is still closed. The world is still on the other side, and for just a little longer, you rest. You wake in the late afternoon light, the kind that slants low through the shutters and turns the dust in the air into gold. Your breasts ache, full, tight, tingling like they might explode at the slightest movement, and your baby has begun to snuffle and stir, rooting blindly toward your chest. It's time again. Feeding, the task you will do more often than you blink, more often than you breathe. In the Middle Ages, nursing wasn't just a maternal duty. It was a moral, spiritual, and social battleground. Your baby latches with a sharp tug that makes you hiss through your teeth. You're still raw. Your nipples are cracked. But you cradle them close anyway because feeding is life, and it's your job. Or is it? See, that depends on who you are. If you're a peasant woman, a farmer's wife, a labourer's daughter, you breastfeed. No one asks. No one offers alternatives. There are no alternatives. Your milk is your child's only source of nourishment. The fields can wait, the laundry can pile, but this you must do. You nurse with a baby strapped to your chest as you grind grain or carry water. You nurse when your body screams for rest, when your breasts are sore, and your back feels like it belongs to a woman twice your age. You nurse through colds, hunger, grief, because if you don't, the baby dies. But if you're noble, that's a different game entirely. In wealthier households, the idea of a highborn woman nursing her own child was considered, well, beneath her, literally, because nursing required lying down or sitting with your breast exposed, a vulnerable domestic act not considered appropriate for women of station. The upper classes worried that nursing weakened a woman, ruined her figure, and interfered with her ability to resume her real duties, like managing the household, appearing at court, or perhaps most importantly, becoming pregnant again. Because here's the kicker. Breastfeeding often delays fertility, so if you were expected to produce more heirs, you needed to wean early, or better yet, never nurse at all. Enter the wet nurse. Hiring a wet nurse was not just a practical choice, it was a status symbol. If you could afford someone else to do the feeding, it meant you were important, cultured, above the raw, leaking mess of early motherhood. These women were often poorer, younger, and newly postpartum themselves. Some had lost their own babies. Some left their infants behind with other women just to earn the wages that came from nursing yours. They were part of an unofficial economy of milk and sacrifice, their bodies rented out one suckle at a time. There were entire books written on the qualifications of a good wet nurse. She should be healthy, of good moral character, preferably blonde. Yes, really. Blonde milk was believed to be lighter and purer. Her milk was judged on colour, taste, smell. If she was suspected of melancholy, her milk was said to be sour. If she'd recently had sex, milk might be tainted. And if she told stories while nursing, that was discouraged. Words, you see, could corrupt the baby's soul or two, travelling down through the milk and planting sin-like seeds. Hiring a wet nurse wasn't just a job transaction, it was a whole relationship. The nurse might live in your home, or your baby might go live with her. Yes, you read that correctly. Wealthy families sometimes sent newborns away to the countryside to be raised by their wet nurse for months or even years. You might see your child once a week, or once a month, or not again until they could walk and talk and didn't even recognize you anymore. But the milk would be fresh, the mother untouched by drudgery. And yes, some women chose to nurse their own children despite their status. It was seen as a spiritual act, a form of bonding that even priests sometimes encouraged. The Virgin Mary was often depicted nursing Jesus after all, and in some religious circles, that image alone was enough to sway opinion. But these women were exceptions. The rule was distance. Oh, hire someone, pass the child off, maintain your shape, your health, your power. Of course, this created tension. Wet nurses were both valued and watched closely. A nurse whose milk dried up might be fired overnight. One whose baby died mysteriously might be accused of negligence, or worse, witchcraft. Some towns even kept lists of certified wet nurses, complete with names, ages, and milk evaluations. There were poems mocking them, prayers asking God to preserve babies despite their nurses, and occasionally records of fights between mothers and nurses when children bonded too closely with the wrong woman. There were also regional differences. In some parts of France and Italy, the practice was so common that wet nurses formed guilds. In England, it was more patchwork, an unspoken system of word-of-mouth recommendations and informal exchanges. In Eastern Europe, communal nursing was more common, women nursing each other's babies as needed, a village-wide system of shared survival. Less judgment, more practicality, but wherever you were, the underlying belief remained. Breast milk wasn't just food, it was essence. It shaped the baby's body, yes, but also their character. A child nursed by a kind, honest woman would grow up to be the same. One nursed by a liar or a thief, destined for trouble. There were even beliefs that the position of the baby during feeding mattered. Right breast for strength, left breast for wisdom. Too much left breast and your son might grow up too sensitive. Too much right and your daughter might get aggressive. The medieval mind had no shortage of opinions. And what happened if a mother couldn't produce milk, or lost it early, or died in childbirth? Then things got dire. Some turned to animal milk, goat usually, but it had to be diluted and heated just right, and feeding a newborn from a horn or rag was a tricky, messy business. Survival rates dropped. Feeding a baby without human milk was gambling with their life. There were makeshift devices too, predecessors of bottles and nipples. Hollowed horns filled with milk plugged with linen to slow the flow, spoons, cups, but each feeding took time, and spilled milk wasn't just frustrating, it could be fatal. Dehydration, infection, malnourishment followed. A wet nurse was always the better bet if you could find one. And so here you are, cradling your child as they nurse from you, because you're not wealthy enough to pass them off, and even if you were, would you want to? Their eyes are closed, their cheeks are full, each swallow feels like victory. Yes, it hurts, yes, you're exhausted, but this moment is yours, not rented, not delegated, just yours. Later, someone will come and offer to take the baby so you can sleep. You might say yes, you might not. The fire will flicker low, the room will grow dim again, but for now, your child drinks, and you give. You give everything. Your child is now a few days old, maybe a week. Time has become a blur, a fog of feedings and half-sleeps and the constant mental loop of, are they breathing? But amid all the worry and the rawness and the perpetual ache that's become your lower back, a small decision is approaching, one you don't get to think about for very long, and certainly not debate over tea and parchment, because in medieval Europe babies aren't left unnamed for long. No, the question of what to call this little human you've ushered into the world is more than a personal choice. It's a religious formality, a social declaration, and depending on where you live, a mild superstition-fueled panic. It starts, like so many things in this period, with baptism. Remember that rushed ritual we talked about, when the priest or midwife doused your newborn's head with water in a flurry of Latin and hope? That moment wasn't just about protecting their soul, it was also the moment they were given their name. You couldn't officially name a child before baptism. In fact, it was considered improper. Some even believed it was dangerous. You don't go giving names to someone who might not stay. That's how you curse things. That's how you tempt fate. So your baby is baptized, probably within a day or two of birth, maybe within hours, especially if they were born small or were blue or just suspiciously quiet. And in that moment the priest or the midwife in emergencies declares their name, loud and clear, for heaven and earth to hear. It's done. That's who they are now. But how do you choose a name in a world where creativity is seen as potentially heretical? You do what everyone else does. You name them after a saint. Medieval names aren't about style or individuality. No one's trying to stand out. You're not flipping through baby name scrolls looking for something unique but meaningful. You're naming your child after someone who can pull strings in heaven. Someone with connections. If you're smart, you go for a saint with a good reputation, strong, wise, miraculous. If your child is born on a saint's feast day, even better. That's considered divine guidance. Born on the feast of St. Brigid? Guess what? Welcome to the world, little Brigid. There's something reassuring about this. Yes, half of the village might be named Thomas or Marguerite or John or Agnes, but at least you know your child has spiritual backup. It's like assigning them a bodyguard in the celestial bureaucracy, and it goes both ways. Many people believe the child would inherit traits from the saint. A girl named Cecilia might grow up musical, a boy named George might become brave, or at the very least moderately competent at slaying dragons in the metaphorical sense. For families with a long lineage, or illusions of one, Names might be passed down through generations. Naming a baby after a grandparent was a way of honouring the dead, keeping them alive in some symbolic way. But again, the saints took priority. Even if your father's name was Wilbert, no one wanted to roll the dice on a non-canonised ancestor when St. Nicholas was right there with a proven track record in seasonal popularity. In some regions, especially among the nobility, children might receive multiple names, one for the saint, one for the Verhooghjotto family, one for the local pun. These names weren't always used in daily life, but they were written down, recorded in church books, and whispered in prayer. In more rural communities, it was usually one name, simple and solid, a name you could shout across a field, stitch into cloth, carve into a headstone. But not every name was created equal. Certain names carried weight. Mary, for example, was practically sacred. You didn't give it lightly. It was often reserved for second daughters or modified into forms like Mariota or Marielle to avoid direct comparison to the Mary. The same went for Jesus. Naming a child that was rare and typically discouraged, unless you were in southern Europe and feeling very brave. There were names associated with bad luck too. Judas? Out. Cain? Definitely not. Even names that sounded vaguely sinful or foreign might be avoided. You didn't want to raise eyebrows or invite speculation. Naming a child was like placing a bet. You wanted to pick a winner. But names weren't only about the child, they were also a reflection on you. The mother, the family. In some cases, the priest himself might intervene if he thought your choice was inappropriate. There are recorded instances of priests refusing to baptize a child until the parents chose a proper Christian name. One stubborn couple insisted on naming their son Faustus. It means lucky. The priest said no. They argued. In the end, the child was baptized as Peter. The priest won. They usually did. For illegitimate children, those born outside of marriage, the naming process could be even more political. Some were given generic saint names, with no surname, no family link. Others were named after the mother's employer, if they were a servant, or after a priest who had agreed to look the other way. The name could be a small kindness or a quiet insult, depending on who was doing the naming. And what if a child died before baptism? That was one of the deepest sorrows, because according to the church, the child not only died unnamed, but unredeemed. These babies were often buried in silence, in separate areas outside consecrated ground. But some mothers, refusing to accept this, gave names anyway, secretly, at home, whispered in the dark. Name without a record, without a ceremony, but full of love. It wouldn't hold up in court. But it meant everything to her. Fringe practices went even further. In certain parts of Europe, people believed that giving a baby a saint's name could actually protect them from death. So if a child fell ill, they might be renamed after a more powerful saint in a kind of last-ditch effort. It was like switching spiritual teams mid-game. Sometimes this even involved a second baptism, not entirely legal, not entirely uncommon. Twins? That brought its own naming rules. They were often given paired names, Peter and Paul, Martha and Mary. Symbolic of balance. You didn't want one twin to have a stronger name than the other. That could lead to imbalance, favoritism, in some stories even tragedy. And then there were the names that just appeared. One mother claimed she heard her baby's name in a dream. Another was convinced a bird whispered it through the window. People laughed, but the name stuck. Back in your own room, the baby sleeps. Finally, after a long stretch of colicky grunting. You look down at them, soft, pink, tightly swaddled, and you whisper their name, the one given at baptism, the one already whispered in 1,000 prayers. Maybe it was your choice. Maybe it was the midwife's. Maybe it was decided long before the child was born. But now it belongs to them, a word they'll carry for life. There's a knock at the door, 2 soft taps, then silence, and before you can even answer, someone pushes it open with the heel of their hand, as if doors are just a suggestion now. It's the healer, not the midwife, not the priest, not your cousin who's been warming up broth by the fire all morning, but the village's unofficial authority on what to do when things still aren't right. She enters with a basket that smells like crushed plants and old linen, sets it down with a dull thud, and gives you a long look, not a cruel one, just a calculating one. Because even though you're upright and breathing and the baby is feeding, she knows better than to trust appearances, because birth is only part of the battle. Now comes recovery, a process medieval medicine was deeply committed to misunderstanding. She pulls a stool close and begins to ask questions, not directly, not formally. Just, observations disguised as small talk. Are you still bleeding? Do your breasts ache only when full or all the time? Does the pain in your belly feel sharp or low and dull like a drumbeat beneath your bones? Do you sleep? Do you cry? You try to answer. You're not even sure anymore. In the Middle Ages, recovery from childbirth was shaped by a potent mixture of ancient theories, folklore, superstition, and one unified medical concept that ran the show, the theory of humours. The body, according to prevailing medical wisdom, if we can even call it that, was ruled by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was the balance of these. Illness, imbalance. You could be too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. And childbirth was considered the ultimate humour disruptor. All that blood, all that strain, it stirred things up inside you like a pot boiling over. So your healer begins with a diagnosis based not on bacteria or anatomy, but on mood, colour, and texture. She asks to see your soiled cloths. She checks their weight, their smell. She examines the blood, noting whether it's bright or dark, thick or thin. And while you sit there trying not to die of embarrassment, she nods gravely. You're still purging, that's good. Because here's the thing, bleeding was expected. In fact, it was required. If you didn't bleed after childbirth, that was a sign something had gone very, very wrong. Maybe the womb hadn't fully emptied. Maybe the humours were backing up. Maybe the devil had taken residence in your uterus, and yes, that was an actual belief. So the healer offers you a bit of tea, mugwort maybe, or pennyroyal, and instructs you to drink it while it's still hot. It'll help move the rest of the blood out, she says. You gag it down like a good patient. Then comes the belly binding. A long strip of cloth tightly wrapped around your midsection, from ribs to hips, to support the organs and help the womb shrink. She pulls it snug, ties it, checks your pulse, not at your wrist, but by pressing her fingers under your tongue. It's as ridiculous as it sounds, but still, you let her. She checks your breast next, nodding approvingly when milk seeps out easily. She watches the baby feed. She presses her ear to your stomach, not because she expects to hear anything, but because that's what her mother did. That's what all the healers did, listening for ghosts of sickness in the silence of your gut. Then she gives you a small linen pouch filled with something gritty. Rue and sage, perhaps, with a pinch of salt and a thread of red wool. Hang this above your bed, she says. It'll keep the cold from settling into your bones. Cold in medieval medical terms was not just temperature. It was energy, a state of being. If your womb went cold, it could harden, shrivel, refuse to bear more children. If your blood cooled too quickly, your mind might follow, dragging you into melancholy. Cold was dangerous. It meant death could sneak in unnoticed. To keep warm, you're advised to eat soft, warming foods, porridge with honey, broth with leeks, spiced wine if you're lucky, no raw greens, no dried fruit, nothing sour. These were thought to worsen the imbalance. One healer even warns you against bathing your feet in cold water, something about heat escaping through the soles and never returning. As strange as it all sounds, there's something deeply human in it. These women, healers, midwives, herbalists, had no modern science, no sterile tools or pharmaceuticals, but they did have knowledge, centuries of it, passed down by a mouth, scratched into the margins of prayer books, muttered over pots of steeping plants. They saw thousands of births. They knew what worked, or what seemed to, and in a world without medicine, that mattered more than theory. Fringe treatments appeared here too, of course. For postpartum cramps, you might be given a charm, a small stone tied to your ankle to pull the pain downward. Some women wore coral necklaces, believed to repel evil spirits and prevent uterine prolapse. Others placed warm bricks wrapped in cloth against their abdomen, a practice that actually sounds pleasant, honestly. And let's talk about your mental state. If you seemed weepy, restless, too quiet, that raised eyebrows. Postpartum depression wasn't understood, not by name, not by science, but it was seen. Women who cried for no reason were said to be sorrow sick. Some said it was caused by the womb wandering, or yes, again with the womb wandering, through the body, looking for the baby it no longer held. A grief-stricken organ, loose in the dark, bumping into other organs and causing havoc. The remedy? A mix of prayer, warm compresses, sweet-smelling herbs, and above all, time. The healer might recommend a special tea. Motherwort, valerian root, something calming. She might suggest holding a chicken in your lap. Don't ask, you won't like the answer. She might tell you to speak your fears aloud into a cup of wine, then pour it into the fire. Symbolic cleansing, not helpful in the strictest sense, but again, these were rituals. And rituals carry power. There's also pressure, of course, from everyone to recover, to smile, to be grateful, to get back to work, back to weaving, back to being the woman you were before your body was split apart and sewn back together by fate and friction. Some people will tell you you've been blessed. Others will remind you that this is your duty. Either way, the clock is ticking. But in this moment, in the quiet room, the healer sits beside you. She applies a salve to the cracked skin around your nipples. She checks the baby's belly. She adds a pinch of dried lavender to your bedding. And before she leaves, she takes your hand, rough and scarred as it is, and says, "Don't rush. The body forgets quickly, but the soul takes longer." You don't answer. You just nod. Because she's right. The physical pain may ease with days and ointments, but the rest of it, the weight of what you've done, what you've risked, what you've become, stays longer. It lives in your breath, in the way you move differently now, in the way your body guards itself, even in sleep. She leaves, basket in hand, walking out into the twilight. And you stay, not broken, not healed, just becoming. The morning light creeps in slowly now, not because the sun is shy, but because your room has become a kind of cave, darkened by thick curtains, low fires, and the kind of stillness that only comes after weeks of bleeding and barely sleeping. Your baby lies beside you. Cheeks full and red, eyelids fluttering like they're dreaming of something ancient. You've started to move around a little more. You've even stood for longer than 5 minutes without feeling like your spine was about to eject itself in protest. The healer hasn't returned in 2 days, which is either a very good sign or a very bad one. But there's something else creeping in. Not fever, not pain, but something a little quieter, a little stranger. You start to notice things, patterns, dreams, whispers, and suddenly you remember something the midwife said during labour, almost like a joke, except it didn't feel like one. Sometimes women come back different. Different how? Let's go there. Let's talk about what happens when the sacred, messy mystery of childbirth doesn't stop at the physical, when it seeps into the strange. Because while most of your neighbours are busy tending to their goats or checking the weather to guess the grain yield, there's always a low-level undercurrent of fear around postpartum women. Not just concern for your health, but suspicion. What if you've been touched by something? What if the veil didn't close all the way behind you? What if the thing that came back isn't entirely but you? And just like that, you stumble into the murky medieval category of the churched but changed. See, it's one thing to recover slowly. Everyone expects that. But if your personality shifts, if you start hearing things or laughing at nothing, or walking in your sleep, that's when the whispers begin. They say the veil between the worlds is thinnest during childbirth, and sometimes it's not the child who passes through, sometimes it's something else. Enter the changeling lore. You've probably heard the stories, everyone has. A healthy baby born at dusk, by morning, sickly, quiet, with eyes too old, the villagers whisper, the fairies have taken it, left a copy behind, a changeling. It looks like your baby, but it isn't. It drinks differently, sleeps too much, cries with a voice that sounds like wind through dead branches. But here's the part they don't talk about as much. Sometimes it's the mother they fear has been changed. Women who return from childbirth with what we'd now call trauma, or postpartum psychosis or depression, were once seen as cursed, possessed, or simply transformed. Not by illness, but by contact, with death, with the devil, with the unknowable forces that roam outside the warmth of the fire. If you began to talk to yourself in the days after giving birth, people watched you closely. If you stared into the fire too long, if you flinched at your child's cries, if you wandered at night, if you refused to hold your baby, that last one, that was nearly always considered unnatural, unmotherly, dangerous. Some called it a failure of the soul, others called it a warning. The old women in the village had their terms for it. She's touched. Her blood's not right. The spirits aren't finished with her. And what did that mean for you? Well, depending on who you were and how much your family loved you, it meant one of two things. Either you were wrapped in extra cloth, given stronger teas, prayed over daily, and quietly waited out. Or if things escalated, if you screamed or refused food or said things that frightened the others, you might be sent away. To a convent, maybe. Or to live with a cousin far from town. A change of air, they'd say. But you knew what it meant. You were no longer seen as safe. One chilling account tells of a woman who, days after giving birth, began speaking in rhymes. She claimed her child was the sun and her breast milk was moonlight. At first, the family laughed. Then she tried to place the baby in the hearth, saying it needed fire to glow properly. They took her away the next morning. She didn't come back. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We don't know what happened to most of those women. Mental illness wasn't understood. The body and soul were believed to be deeply connected, inseparable. If the body bled strangely or the mind unravelled, it meant the soul was fractured. And the remedies weren't kind. In fringe circles, people believed these changed mothers had crossed into fairy realms during labour and not quite returned whole. Some rituals were designed to retrieve them, ceremonies where women were bathed in herbs under moonlight, or made to walk backward in a circle 9 times while holding a candle. One involved hiding the baby and then rediscovering it, to shock the mother's soul back into alignment. Most of it was nonsense, but desperate nonsense, and sometimes it worked. Maybe not because of the ritual, but because someone believed in her recovery, because they treated her like someone who could return instead of someone who was already gone. There are glimpses in old texts of mothers who did come back, women who wandered the woods for days, then reappeared and resumed life with no memory of what had happened. Some said it was the work of St. Dymphna, the patron of the mad. Others whispered about second souls, doubled spirits, something half-healed but whole enough to move forward. And yet even the ordinary mothers, those who didn't unravel completely, still changed. You feel it now, don't you? The way your thoughts come slower, deeper, the way certain sounds trigger something in you that has no name, the way you watch your baby's chest rise and fall not just with love, but with dread, the sheer terror of loss. Even your dreams have changed. You wake at night sweating, breath caught in your throat. You see fire, flood, your baby slipping from your arms into darkness. You wake and they're fine. But your heart is a wild thing thudding against your ribs like it wants out. That's not madness, that's motherhood. In its rawest, oldest form, you aren't possessed, you aren't broken, but yes, you're different now. You've carried life inside you. You've crossed into the most primal, chaotic acts known to human bodies. You've spilled blood and begged and breathed through pain that would make hardened men weep. Of course you've changed. And in the world outside your room, where people want neat stories and steady smiles, that change is scary. It reminds them that life is fragile, that women hold power they don't always understand, that some transformations don't end with the cutting of a cord. So yes, maybe you walk slower now, maybe you stare too long at the window, maybe you hold your child tighter than necessary. Just to be sure, you've come back from the edge and not everyone returns the same. The baby is quiet, finally, mouth slack, arms twitching in a sleep that's both fragile and impossibly deep, like they're floating just below the surface of the world. You sit there watching, one hand resting gently on their chest, feeling the rise and fall like it's the only clock that matters anymore. You haven't left the house in days, and when you look at your reflection in the small metal mirror across the room, you hardly recognize yourself. Your eyes are darker, not bruised exactly, just weathered, like they've seen something and don't plan on forgetting it anytime soon. At some point, the thought creeps in, quiet and sour. What if something happens to me? You've made it this far, you've survived childbirth, the bleeding has slowed, the midwife hasn't returned with a grim expression. The baby is thriving, wrapped tight and warm, but still, you feel the weight of your own mortality hanging just behind your shoulder. Because in the Middle Ages, motherhood didn't come with guarantees. In fact, the most dangerous period for many women wasn't labour, it was the weeks after. This is the part nobody really wants to talk about. Postpartum death was common enough that it didn't always get its own term in parish records, just died after childbirth, sometimes a day later, sometimes a week, sometimes horrifyingly, after seeming to recover, sitting up in bed, eating, laughing, only to be found cold and grey by morning. It was like a ghost had been waiting patiently for everyone to stop watching. Today we know the terms: puerperal fever, postpartum sepsis, hemorrhage. In medieval terms it was simply childbed fever, or the rot, or womb heat. They didn't know the science, but they knew the symptoms: high fever, chills, foul-smelling discharge, flushed skin, rapid death. One day you're nursing, the next you're delirious, sweating through the sheets, and whispering prayers you can't quite remember the words to, the cause, infection. But no one called it that. They blamed bad air, evil spirits, a cold draft across your bare belly. A sinful thought at the wrong moment. Even your dreams could be suspect if you'd imagined fire, or water, or drowning. The midwife might check your bed linens, sniffing discreetly for signs of unwholesome vapours. If the bleeding was too light, they might try to induce more with herbs. If it was too much, they'd bind your legs and feed you wine spiked with poppy. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And here's the part that stings. People didn't always wait long to replace you. In poor households, the line between grief and survival was razor thin. If a mother died postpartum, the focus immediately shifted to the baby. Who would feed it? Who would care for it? If you were lucky, your sister, your mother, a neighbour would step in. If not, your husband might remarry within weeks, not because he didn't love you, but because the baby needed a wet nurse. The house needed order. Life had to move forward, even if yours had just ended. In noble families, it was even more transactional. Some women, particularly those married off for political alliances, weren't even buried before negotiations for their replacement began. Your death was a tragedy, sure, but also an inconvenience, a name to cross off, a dowry to reassess. It wasn't heartless, it was just efficient, cold, yes, but necessary. Some mothers, sensing this, took precautions. In the days after birth, if they were still strong enough to sit upright, they'd summon a priest. Not for confession, though that was part of it, but to draft a will, a testamentum. These weren't long, spruzzling legal documents, just enough to state their wishes. Who gets the baby if they die? Who should take their rosary beads? Who should bury them, and where? Some even left letters, scratched onto parchment if they were literate, or dictated to someone who could write. These letters were rarely saved. They were too personal, but you know the kinds of things they said. You can feel it. Take care of my child, tell them I loved them, burn my clothing so no bad spirits linger in the cloth. Don't let them forget me. These quiet goodbyes were folded into boxes, pressed into the hands of sisters, hidden beneath pillows, just in case. And it wasn't just illness. Death could sneak in through bleeding too. A torn womb, a clotted vein, a slip and fall on the hard, cold floor. There was no safety net, no hospital, no IV drip humming softly in the background. If something happened, you had minutes, maybe an hour, before everything slipped away. And so women became their own alarm bells. They knew what signs to watch for. The change in the colour of blood, the smell, the pulsing pain that didn't go away, the fever that rose too quickly. In some places, women were buried with their babies. In others, the baby was kept alive, but only if they had someone to feed them. Sometimes the infant followed the mother within days. A double funeral. A pair of tiny shoes placed on a grave. You'd be amazed how many medieval cemeteries contain women and newborns buried together, curled in death the same way they might have been in life. And still, they kept going. Women kept giving birth, kept risking it, kept walking into the fire of pain and blood and shadow, because what else was there? You wanted children. You needed heirs. You needed hands to help you spin, farm, clean. You wanted love. You wanted to pass something down, to matter. And so you took the risk, again and again. There were rituals meant to protect you. Candles lit during labour named after saints. Crosses etched in chalk above the bed. You might wear a belt blessed by a priest, believed to guard against death in childbed. A lock of your mother's hair tucked under your pillow. A pinch of salt on your tongue before the first pain hit. Some women didn't wait for death. They tried to bargain with it. Vows to enter a convent if they survived. Promises to feed the poor. To build a well. To name the child after a saint no one liked. Anything. You glance at your baby now, cheeks round and mouth open in sleep. You're alive. They're alive. But you still feel it, don't you? That thin line, that breath-wide space between this world and the next. You press a kiss to their forehead and hold them closer. Not out of fear exactly, but because you know you've faced death and for now you've come back. The days are stretching longer now, the sun climbing a little higher each time you peek through the shutter. Someone, your sister maybe, or that old neighbour who always smells faintly of yeast, has started airing the bed linens, letting in light and the scent of dry grass. You've been upright more often, walking cautiously from bed to hearth, holding your belly like it might slide out if you take a corner too quickly. The baby no longer feels like a stranger. They squeak, they grunt, they smell like milk and smoke, and the people around you, they've started talking about when you'll return to normal. But normal, as you quickly learn, is a moving target, especially in a world that has very strict opinions about what a mother should be. The medieval understanding of motherhood was many things: sacred, biological, expected, but above all it was public. Everyone had a say in it, everyone watched, everyone judged. You weren't just a woman who'd survived childbirth, you were now a moral symbol, a spiritual representative, a kind of communal property whose body and behaviour were officially part of the public interest. No pressure, you start to feel it the moment you step outside again, maybe for the first time in weeks. The first few faces you see soften with relief. They're glad you made it. You're congratulated. You're offered dried herbs, slices of bread, a slap on the back if you're lucky, but beneath that, there's evaluation, a tiny narrowing of the eyes. Are you smiling enough? Too much? Do you look weak? Do you look too strong? You're now part of a role that's been written long before you were born. The good mother. She is patient. She is kind. She speaks softly. She wears her grief modestly. She feeds her baby without complaint. She keeps house. She doesn't laugh too loud. She doesn't rest too long. She gets on with it. In reality, most mothers lived somewhere in the wide, messy middle. But the ideal lingered. It showed up in sermons, in poetry, in saints' lives. St. Monica wept endlessly for her son Augustine until he turned holy. St. Elizabeth bathed lepers and breastfed the poor. And then, of course, there was Mary, the ultimate template. Serene, obedient, perpetually clean despite the whole stable situation. You are now expected to be one part Mary, one part martyr, and one part milk cow. And if you failed, if you raised your voice, if your baby cried too much, if your house looked messy or your dress too fine, people noticed. Gossip in a medieval village was faster than the plague. A neighbour might note how odd it is that you're not smiling more, that your baby cries at dusk, that you seem to linger too long by the well, and heaven help you if your child got sick. Because when that happened, the first question wasn't what caused the illness, it was what did the mother do? Did you eat the wrong food? Did you walk in moonlight? Did you speak ill of a saint? Was your milk tainted by a sinful thought or a jealous dream? There's a chilling story told in one 14th century village about a woman whose baby fell ill with fever. She had been overheard cursing during a thunderstorm the week before. That was enough. She was brought before the priest, asked to confess. The baby died a few days later. She was never charged with murder because what happened was worse. Everyone just stopped speaking to her. This wasn't unique. In a time when science wasn't much more than prayer with extra steps, mothers bore the brunt of blame. A sick child was a mother's failing. A malformed baby, proof of her sin, a child who didn't speak or walk on time, maybe a punishment, or maybe, as was whispered in hushed circles, a sign that the child was never really hers to begin with. You see, while we've already covered the changeling legends, there was also a subtler version, one where the mother herself was suspected of letting in something unnatural. If you showed too much pride, too much love, or even just talked too much about your baby's beauty, you were accused of tempting fate. Bragging invited the attention of spirits. The solution? Say nothing. Keep your joy private. Swallow it. So women developed rituals. You spit lightly on the baby's forehead to confuse the spirits. You tie red thread around their wrist. You avoid calling them beautiful directly. Instead, you say things like, "Oh, this one is a bit plain, isn't she?" with a knowing smile. You deflect, you protect, you pretend not to love them so much it hurts. Even your relationship with your own body becomes more complicated. Breastfeeding is still expected, unless you're wealthy enough to pass that task on, but your body now belongs to the child, the church, and the community. People will comment on your figure, how quickly it's returned or hasn't, whether your hips are wider, whether your breasts are too full. Some women, especially young first-time mothers, become objects of fascination. There are documented cases of men sneaking glimpses during breastfeeding, not out of perversion exactly, but curiosity. Some scholars even wrote about holy milk, believing that a mother's milk could transmit not just nutrition, but virtue. Yes, virtue. And yes, people absolutely tried to bottle it. In one odd fringe tradition, it was believed that a cloth soaked in the milk of a pious mother could heal fevers or ward off demons, not so much liquid gold as divine dairy. You, of course, just want to stop leaking through your tunic. Some of the older women have started talking to you about discipline. The baby is still tiny, but advice comes early. How to raise a child properly. How to shape their will before it sets wrong. Don't let them sleep with you too long. Don't pick them up every time they cry. Swaddle tight, ignore the tears, or if you live further east or in a smaller village, the advice might swing the other way. Keep them on your body. Wrap them close, sing to them constantly, never let their feet touch the ground before their first blessing. It's a mess of contradictions. No one agrees on anything, except that whatever happens later in this child's life, it will be your fault. And yet you manage. You learn to smile at the gossip without absorbing it. You learn to fake sleep so someone else will carry the baby for 5 minutes. You learn which herbs will help your milk let down and which will stop it entirely for when it's time. You learn to pray not just for your baby's life but for your own sanity, because somewhere deep inside you understand this truth. Being a mother in this world isn't about being perfect. It's about surviving other people's expectations. And tonight, after the fire dies down, you'll lie beside your baby and whisper to them the things you're not supposed to say aloud, that they're perfect, that they're yours, that no spirit, no sickness, no gossiping neighbour can take this bond from you. And when they look up at you, those round ancient eyes barely open, you'll remember who you are, not just a mother, but the woman who made them. There's a particular silence that settles over a house once the chaos of birth has passed. It's not peace, exactly. It's more like a vacuum. The loud parts are over. The screams, the wailing, the rush of feet across floorboards, and now the quiet hovers in the corners, watching you. People stop checking in as often. The healer moves on to another house. The neighbours return to their routines. The midwife has other labours to attend. The novelty of your newborn has faded just slightly, and now you're alone with the long-term project of keeping them alive. You wake up early, not because you want to, but because your body doesn't understand time anymore. Your breasts are sore, your thighs still ache, and your bladder has developed a whole new personality, one that demands immediate attention. Your baby is stirring beside you, snuffling with that frantic pre-cry urgency. You lift them, position them to nurse, and for a moment everything is quiet again except the suckling sound and the low crackle of the fire. Then a knock. Not the light. Hesitant tap of your sister or the neighbour with broth. This one is sharp, authoritative. It's the priest. You know why he's here. He's come to talk about your churched state. That's right. You've reached the point in your postpartum journey where the church officially wants to welcome you back into religious society. You are technically no longer unclean. But before you can go back to Mass, before you can kneel before the altar or even stand inside the church proper, you have to be purified. It's not quite an exorcism, not quite a blessing. It's a little bit of both, with a healthy dash of patriarchy thrown in for flavour. You wrap your shawl around your shoulders, gesture for someone to hold the baby, and step outside for the first time in weeks. The sun feels foreign. The air has that early autumn bite, crisp but not cruel. The priest stands there with his book of hours, his fingers already holding the page. He doesn't smile. Priests don't smile during this kind of thing. He simply nods, turns, and starts walking. You follow. The ritual is called the churching of women. It's been around since the earliest days of Christianity, though it shifted and mutated over time. By the Middle Ages, it was a formal part of a woman's post-birth timeline, typically performed around 30 to 40 days after delivery, though the timing varied depending on your health, the calendar, and whether the local priest liked you or not. It marked the end of your unclean period and your return to the community. But let's pause for a second, because here's where it gets thorny. Theologically, the church insisted this wasn't about sin. Childbirth, after all, was considered a natural process. You hadn't done anything wrong, but also you'd bled. A lot. And blood, according to centuries of religious tradition, rendered a person ritually impure. There were echoes of Old Testament rules here. Leviticus-level thinking about bodily fluids and sacred spaces. So no, you weren't sinful, but you were spiritually grubby. And the church would very much like to tidy that up before letting you back inside. The ceremony is short. You kneel at the door of the church while the priest murmurs a psalm, usually Psalm 121, the one about lifting your eyes to the hills. He sprinkles you with holy water, says a prayer over your head, and leads you to the altar. Sometimes you carry a candle. Sometimes you make an offering, bread, a coin, a bit of linen. He recites a final blessing, and that's it. You're back. You can take communion again, you can sit in the women's pews, you can belong. In some places, the ceremony ends with a literal embrace of the altar, as if you're hugging your way back into grace. But let's not romanticize it too much. This was also a moment of surveillance. Your reappearance was a public event. People came to see who had survived, to look at your face and guess how the birth had gone, to note whether your baby was there in your arms or conspicuously absent. Some women dreaded this day, not because they feared the ritual, but because they feared the stares. They feared being asked, "How many children now?" and having to answer, "2 living," or 1, but she was a twin, or worse, none. Others embraced the day. Dressed in their best cloak, hair brushed, baby fed and quiet, they walked proudly into the church, making sure everyone saw them reclaim their place. It was a flex, honestly, a survival badge. Yes, I almost died. No, I didn't. Yes, I'm still here. There were superstitions, of course. Some believed it was bad luck to leave your home before churching, that doing so invited spirits, that you were still vulnerable to illness, to curses, to the evil eye. If you had to step outside for water, for firewood, you were supposed to tie a red ribbon around your wrist and say a specific prayer under your breath. Others ignored this completely. Life didn't pause just because your uterus was still rearranging itself. And here's the odd thing, some women actually liked the ritual. It was one of the few moments that acknowledged what they'd been through, that marked the passage from one state to another, from pregnant to postpartum, from liminal to returned, from bleeding to healed. It was a line drawn in sand, thin, maybe, but visible. Of course, no one asked how you felt about being back. No one asked whether you were still bleeding lightly at night, or if your baby's cries still made your heart race, or if you were afraid to sleep too deeply for fear you wouldn't wake. None of that mattered now. You'd been purified. You were officially fine. The churching rite didn't just welcome you back to religious life, it restored your social position. You were once again fit for company, fit to be seen, fit to stand among other women, as a mother, a wife, a functioning part of society. Before this, you were seen as in between, a threshold, something to be gently avoided, or quietly blessed, or, if you were unlucky, gossiped about. And now you're walking home, candle stubs still in your hand, cloak fluttering against your legs. The baby is asleep again, curled against your sister's chest. The house smells of bread. A neighbour sees you pass and nods. She's been churched, that nod says. She's come through it. It's not exactly a parade, but it is something. You cross the threshold of your house again, not just as a woman who has given birth, but as someone returned, not entirely healed, not entirely unchanged, but recognised, marked, reclaimed. And you exhale. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, you allow yourself to believe that things might be normal again. Not the old normal, but a new kind, one shaped by everything you've endured and everything you've become. You set down the candle, you pick up your child, and you carry on. It's twilight again, the hour when the fields blur into the tree line and everything takes on that soft, gold-tinged hush. You're sitting just outside your door, wrapped in a shawl that smells faintly of smoke and lavender, your child warm against your chest. They've grown, not by much, still a bundle of soft limbs and half-lidded eyes, but enough that you can feel the difference in your arms. Heavier, rooted, like they belong here, like they've decided to stay. And you've made it. Through the blood, through the fever dreams, through the rituals and ribbons and rough hands that pulled you back from the edge more than once. You've been churched. You've fed and swaddled and stared into the fire until it blinked first. You've returned to the land of the living. Now, finally, there's space to ask, what happens next? Because surviving childbirth in the Middle Ages wasn't the end of the story. It was just the opening chapter of a long, demanding book called Medieval Motherhood, and you've barely made it past the prologue. Your days will stretch forward now, filled with tasks both ordinary and profound, feeding, clothing, watching, worrying, praying, always praying. You'll measure time by teething, first steps, fevers and seasons, by how many eggs the chickens lay, by how quickly your child's hair curls or doesn't, by whether they survive their second year or their fifth. Statistically, you're going to bury at least one of your children. That's just the reality. In some places and times, a third of children didn't live past the age of 5. Fevers came on fast, teeth got infected, wells turned foul. And while the church offered comfort, God's will, they said, it didn't patch the hollow place left behind when a child's blanket no longer needed folding. Some mothers handled the loss quietly, washing the linens in silence and returning to work the next day. Others broke entirely. You'll hear the stories whispered around fires. The woman who wandered barefoot into the woods and returned a week later with white hair. The one who dug a shallow grave in her garden because she couldn't bear to let the priest take the baby away. You'll listen and nod and hold your child tighter. But if your child survives, and let's say they do, because tonight we're being kind, then the next chapter begins. Education, if you can call it that, starts early. You'll teach them their prayers, of course. You'll point to the saints on the wall-hung cloths and tell their stories, the same way your mother did. You'll show them how to hold a spoon, how to shape bread, how to keep their hands still during Mass. If you're poor, you'll teach them to work, how to patch clothing or feed animals or keep track of younger siblings. If you're wealthy, someone else will do all that, but you'll still oversee it. You'll still be blamed if the child turns out spoiled or strange. Motherhood doesn't end. Not here. Not ever. It stretches forward into every part of your life. Even if you go on to have more children, 2, 3, 7, you never really start over. Each birth is its own storm, but the weather never clears completely. There's always a new cloud on the horizon, and yes, more children likely await. You've proven yourself capable, which means your husband, or your in-laws, or the local lord, depending on your situation, expects more. You've been marked as fertile, which in this time is both a compliment and a burden. You'll feel the weight of future pregnancies like a stone you carry in your apron pocket, always there waiting to be picked up again, and you'll carry other burdens too. The burden of staying alive in a world that doesn't prioritise your comfort. The burden of keeping children alive without access to clean water, safe medicines, or basic knowledge of how germs work. The burden of reputation. If you speak too softly, you're timid. Too loudly, you're scorned. If your child is too thin, it's your fault. If they misbehave in church, it's your fault. If they die in the night, some might still say it's your fault. But there is joy. Small, unruly joy. Like the moment your baby laughs for the first time, and the sound startles you because it's too bright, too new, or the way they crawl toward you on unsteady hands, dragging a bit of linen behind them like a proud little knight. Or the quiet hours before dawn, when it's just you and their steady breath and the fire hasn't quite died yet and everything feels possible again. You start to notice how many things you know now. How to rock the cradle with your foot while churning butter. How to sleep with one ear open for coughing. How to bind a cut with nothing but cloth and honey. You know which cry means hungry and which one means just lonely. You know the rhythms of your own body again, not the frightened throb of recovery, but something steadier, stronger. And one day someone will come to you, maybe a cousin, maybe the neighbour girl who just got married, and she'll ask shyly what it's really like, giving birth, having a baby, becoming something else, and you'll tell her the truth. That it's terrifying, that it's beautiful, that it's a kind of holy madness, that the pain doesn't last, but the change does. You won't sugarcoat it. You'll tell her about the blood, the tearing, the strange things you thought while pushing, about the healer with her bitter herbs, about the way time folded in on itself during those first weeks. And maybe, just maybe, you'll tell her that even now, months later, you still wake up sometimes just to check if your baby's chest is moving. But you'll also tell her this: you come back. Not the same, never the same, but you do return, as yourself, as a mother, as something more than you were before. The stars are starting to appear now, one by one, like they're being sewn into the sky. You carry your baby back inside, heart soft and swollen. Tomorrow will bring more tasks, washing, feeding, maybe even another visit from that chatty neighbour who never brings food but always brings opinions. But tonight, for now, the house is still, and in the quiet, you sit and hold your child. You survived childbirth in the Middle Ages. You survived everything that came after, and maybe, just maybe, you're finally beginning to live. So now you lie there, body half curled, blanket tangled around your ankles, the rhythm of breath slowing as the images of everything you've just imagined flicker dimly in your mind. You didn't just hear a story tonight, you lived it. You gave birth in a room that smelled like sweat and ash. You clutched a stranger's hand, you shouted at saints, you bled, you healed, you changed, you crossed the boundary that every mother before you has crossed, whether in a stone cottage or a city hospital or a firelit medieval hut. And now you're back, whole, but never quite the same. You can still hear the creak of the cradle beside the hearth, the quiet chant of a midwife, the murmur of gossip just outside your window. And somehow it's comforting, because even though the world back then was rough and raw and often cruel, the women in it kept going. They carried children and stories and songs and names. They carried pain, yes, but also power. Maybe you'll dream of that firelit room tonight. Maybe your brain will replay the rustle of linen, the hiss of herbs in boiling water, the feeling of a baby placed in your arms for the very first time. And if not, if you drift instead into plain, empty blackness, that's okay too. Your body needs rest. You've just been through something enormous, and tomorrow, you'll wake up in your own bed, in your own time, no churching required, No red thread on the wrist, just the memory of what you've learned, what you've survived, and the quiet knowledge that had you been born then, you might have survived it too. Sweet dreams, time traveller. You did well tonight.